Good morning from Jakarta, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, members of the audience. Welcome back to the conference towards open and inclusive regionalism. This conference is hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS Indonesia, in cooperation with the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS, Japan, and the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, Singapore. This CSIS GRIPS RSIS conference is part of the Policy Research Network of Contemporary Southeast Asia, PRN-SEA, a policy research project by GRIPS Japan in collaboration with the universities and research institutes in ASEAN. My name is Rocky Intan, and I will continue to be your host for this second day of this virtual event. Before we begin today's event, please allow me to remind participants joining us here at Zoom that we have an interpretation feature in this conference, which you can access in the right-hand corner of your Zoom application. And I would also like to announce a quick rundown of today's event. We will directly proceed with the three remaining sessions of today's event, namely maritime security, connectivity, and sustainable development goals. Before further ado, I would like to invite Ms. Jane Chan from RSIS to moderate our first session of maritime security. Ms. Jane Chan is a senior fellow and coordinator of the Maritime Security Program at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. Her main research interests include maritime security issues in Southeast Asia, law and order at the sea, regional maritime cooperation and confidence building measures, and regional boundary limitation and territorial disputes. Jane, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Gilang, for that kind introduction. Very good morning, one and all. Please allow me to first say a few words of thanks to the organizers, CSIS, GRIPS, and of course my colleagues at RSIS for the invitation. We are at panel 4, which will focus on maritime cooperation. We heard yesterday in the other sessions assessments on vexing regional and international developments with panelists and participants as well, sharing their perspective on pushing forward with cooperation within the basic premise of an open and inclusive regionalism. So we in this panel will dwell a bit more into the positive theme of cooperation and to look specifically on maritime cooperation, yeah? So the panelists with me today were given a rather difficult task of needing to cover a very broad range of issues, such as what is the best way to promote maritime cooperation in specific areas, such as maritime security, prevention of illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, energy developments, and protection of the marine environment. Within that scope, we are not only talking about cooperation within ASEAN, we wish to also consider avenues to enhance maritime cooperation between ASEAN dialogue partners and ASEAN. So as if these were not enough, we have also heard specific questions being raised yesterday on ASEAN's maritime priorities as well, such as whether maritime domain awareness is important and a priority to ASEAN, and whether ASEAN can strengthen existing maritime cooperation mechanisms without forming new ones. In my view, these issues are in themselves not new. And lucky for us today, we have three eminent experts in this panel who has been following this issue closely and will share their thoughts and assessment on the topic at hand. We will start with two speakers, following by a discussant. First up will be Rear Admiral Romel Jude Ong. The Good Admiral is currently a professor of praxis at the Ateneo School of Government in the Philippines. Prior to that, he was assigned to various senior command and staff positions before retiring as the Vice Commander of the Philippine Navy in 2019. Following Rear Admiral Ong will be an old friend from Vietnam, Dr. Nguyen Thilanan, who is currently the Director General of the East Asia Institute at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, DAV in short. She was the longtime Vice Dean of the International Law Faculty at the DAV before leaving for a short diplomatic stint a few years ago. Serving as discussant in this panel today is Dr. Alex Bristol. Dr. Bristol is currently a Deputy Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI's Defence Strategy and National Security Program. Before that, he was with the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Given the limited time that we have in this panel, I do aspire to be a good timekeeper. May I kindly ask our speakers to limit their remarks to 10 minutes each, and for Dr. Bristol to share his comment in 8 minutes. Without further ado, Remember Ong, your 10 minutes starts now. Please, sir.
Thank you, Jane. May I ask Rocky to share the slide? So I frame my topic as a maritime security cooperation in the South China Sea, basically to provide a tighter context to the discussion. But I think the process itself in the discussion could be replicated in other areas. Next slide, please. So maritime security, before we talk of cooperation, we need to look at what maritime security is among the different stakeholders within ASEAN and outside of ASEAN. Yes, next slide, please. So as you can see, there are different ways of skinning the cat in terms of what is maritime security among different stakeholders. And I would presume that among different member states, they also have their own way of looking at things in terms of maritime security. Next slide, please. So over the years, there were different mechanisms or bodies that were organized and still existing within and outside of ASEAN that are delving into matters of maritime security. And I put out there the alphabet soup of different acronyms representing different mechanisms and bodies that have different mandates and different areas of concern in terms of maritime security. So next slide, please. Now we look at challenges to cooperation. Okay, and these are challenges within the member states and within ASEAN itself. So I think we have to consider one, how we look at our own geography vis-a-vis how the maritime environment plays into it. Example, there are parts of ASEAN that are landlocked, and I think their idea of maritime would be different. Then we have to look at the political part, the leadership, and of course, how the foreign policy is constructed within the different member states. Economic relations, structural, the institutional dynamics in the respective bureaucracies. And I'm sure for some archipelagic states like the Philippines, who have army-centric militaries, they share our concern or our problem of having to deal with resource management. I mean, you are an archipelagic state, and yet most of the resources are provided to ground forces. Then there are security priorities in terms of maritime types of security concerns versus other non-traditional concerns that are equally important, and it changes from state to state. Then, of course, there's that strategic competition between US and China, which is always there. It's the elephant in the room in all discussions. And if you look at ASEAN itself, basing on the literature that I've read, we've created mechanisms that are stovepipe. Question is, are they talking to each other? Then there's the complaint of too many meetings, too little time, and too few people to attend those meetings. So those are the little things that creates problems for cooperation to take place. I mean, substantive cooperation to take place. Next slide, please. I realized that if we go to the discussion in session 1, the first session yesterday, there's an aversion to looking at US-China strategic competition from ASEAN perspective. But I have to put it out there. You, as a naval professional, and my training, my mental model is to look at how other countries think in terms of strategy and how they do want to implement it. So from here, for China, I think, and its maritime objectives are very clear, and there are 4 of them. But I will only delve into one, which is sea control. I believe that one of their objectives is sea control over the north, the East, and the South China Sea. There are only three ways of dealing with maritime strategy. It's either you aspire for command of the sea, you aspire for sea control, or you aspire for sea denial. So I think here we can rightfully place that Chinese maritime strategy is anchored on sea control. Now, the enablers of sea control, as far as I'm concerned, are three: the Navy, the Coast Guard, and the militia. But for the purpose of this, my presentation, I will only focus on the militia itself. And that will be evident in how the discourse comes to later on. Next slide, please. I try to create a framework for the mental model I'm looking at in terms of all the things that are going on. So ASEAN is not the only player in town or the only game in town. There are things moving. There are many moving pieces as far as maritime security is concerned. And I try to sort it out into who are the players as far as maritime security. The first one would be the member state itself, engage in bilateral activities. Then you have the ASEAN Plus, which is ASEAN plus dialogue partners. You have ASEAN only, and of course, the new phenomenon that's coming in with minilaterals or the ASEAN minus. Okay. And I tried to sort it out again in terms of what activities these players are doing. So you have the traditional concerns, the non-traditional security concerns, you have maritime domain awareness, and of course, capacity building. Now here, I blocked off traditional security concern for ASEAN Plus, ASEAN, and ASEAN minus. My point being, traditional security concerns are being addressed by the member states by themselves. And I take the example of the Philippines. As far as we're concerned, since ASEAN could not be the proper mechanism for us to address traditional concerns, we do it on a bilateral basis. So I think you're well aware of the Philippine-US alliance. Then we have recently the 2+2 with Japan. And just this month, we just concluded the discussion between Japan, the United States, and the Philippines, which I think is a precursor towards a more or less a trilateral arrangement between the three countries. Now, then you have the ASEAN Plus, ASEAN, and the ASEAN minus. We can deep dive this framework if you want during the Q&A. In the interest of time, I will move forward. Next slide, please. So I think that we can safely say that ASEAN and even ASEAN Plus is primarily predisposed toward non-traditional concerns. Okay? And most of its mechanisms and bodies created and still existing gravitate towards addressing non-traditional concerns. In a sense, it is the comfort zone where we all can have a conversation and talk about cooperation. Okay, next slide. Now, allow me now to outline the broad strokes of what I think would be a workable cooperation framework within the context of ASEAN. Now, for ASEAN Plus mechanisms, I think it should be a neutral ground for everybody, since we have invited other partners outside of ASEAN. I hate to use the word talk shop, but I think that is what it should be, a talk shop. And it should be postured as an interlocutor so to major power competition, meaning somebody that can referee the two major powers. Okay. And focus only on benign activities like HADR and Navy marine scientific research. The other aspects that are in the ASEAN Plus may be moved back to ASEAN-only type mechanisms. Okay, and they could be consolidated. Maritime security initiatives could be consolidated under the ADMM. You have the ASEAN Navy Chiefs. You have the ADM Expert Working Group on Maritime Security. And you have the ASEAN Our Eyes mechanism, which is a pattern after the 5 Eyes, purely for intelligence sharing. My only concern here is that it seems to have focused on counterterrorism, where I think from my previous life as a naval intelligence officer, it shouldn't be focused on one concern only. I mean, part of intelligence is forecasting problems in the future. Okay, and I don't think that stovepiping to one area is the right direction to go. Then you have the maritime domain awareness, and here I bring in an existing facility, which is the Singapore's Changi Information Fusion Center into the narrative. And I think the ASEAN should focus on naval exercises, intelligence exchange, and maybe shipbuilding. We talked of RCEP yesterday, and looking at a regional supply chain. Okay. And maybe this is one area to work on. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'll be wrapping up. This is my last slide. Second to the last slide. So for the things that the ASEAN cannot do, I think the best direction would be a unilateral arrangement. But the problem is this something that the ASEAN would like to do by itself, because it can happen with or without ASEAN intervention. Okay, so we look at that the Indo-Malfi PCA Indo-Malfi as a template, and here I propose three options: either an ASEAN-only arrangement, an ASEAN plus arrangement, or an ASEAN with a middle power arrangement. And last slide, please, Rocky. I chose the unilateral option of an ASEAN minus plus a middle power. And I'm looking here for just an example. I'm looking at Japan. It's an example of a dialogue partner that an ASEAN minus can work with to address the issues of IUUF, protection of fishing activities, protection of oil and gas exploration, and enforcement of maritime environment protocols. And there are three components that we can look at. And that is a Coast Guard forum, which is already, it started out, but it fizzled out. But there is an existing one, actually, what we call the Southeast Asian Maritime Law Enforcement Initiative. Problem is, it's a US-led initiative. But it is something that we can work on. For maritime domain awareness, we already have the Changi Information Future Center of the Singapore that we can work on. And we can connect our different MDA centers. The Philippines has three. One for fisheries, one for naval, and one for Coast Watch. Okay. And I presume that other countries have their own MDA centers that can be connected to Changi. We can decide to join RECAP, and later on we can decide to join the nascent Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative as well. The last component would be an MLSA, or a logistics agreement, that can help share the support system to others within the context of a Coast Guard forum. So it will be a sharing in terms of facilities, supplies, materials, fuel, that can help the participants. Okay. With that, I close, and thank you and good morning.
Thank you very much, Admiral Ong, for giving us a very broad overview in terms of the issues, the maritime issues that our regional countries face. An assessment of existing mechanisms and institutions, a lot of them overlapping, a lot of them non-effective, of course. And most valuable, of course, is that you've put up some new proposal in terms of cooperative models, right? Be it ASEAN with a dialogue partner, or actually ASEAN minus X plus a dialogue partners. Essentially, what I draw from it is that it is important for us to draw on partners of interest, right? Of common interest, with common interest coming together, targeting a specific issue. Very pragmatic, but we look forward to comments and from participants in terms of your proposal. Moving on to our next speaker, Dr. Nguyen. You also have 10 minutes. Floor is yours. Aun, are you here?
Thank you very much, Jane. Speak already mentioned the current mechanism of maritime cooperation in ASEAN. I actually did the same job with him to review all the current mechanism and see that actually, the maritime cooperation idea has been widely promoted in all of the ASEAN fora, well as mentioned important ASEAN documents. Cooperation were mainly implemented through discussion at perhaps functional technical workshops, reaching joint statements, grand action plan and guidelines at ministerial level, establishing focal points, conducting tabletop exercise and field training exercise. So those are the kind that maritime cooperation has been conducted so far in different maritime forum and different kind of mechanism within ASEAN. So it's very important in shaping for ideas, coordinating in policy and building trust among each other. However, unfortunately, it's insufficient to address the deterioration of the marine environment as well as the rapid development in the field. So therefore, when I saw the topic, how to promote maritime cooperation, maritime security cooperation, particularly in maritime security, in IUU fishing, in marine environment protection, etc. I think that, it is both a new topic. We have been talking and we've been trying to promote the maritime cooperations for so many times. And the root cause for the current situation is because the existence of bilateral and multilateral sovereignty and maritime dispute. Whenever the idea of cooperation comes up, it's always difficult to raise where and how to cooperate. It's very difficult, especially it involved with China, to be honest, because the claim China is, as the previous speaker has mentioned, is cover most of the South China Sea and it's really not rooted in the common legal basis with the other ASEAN claimants. However, we are fortunate enough to have the South China Sea Arbitral Award, in which is rule out the legal basics of the 9-dash line, and it also limit the actual disputed maritime zones in the South China Sea. The rest is actually laying with the ASEAN claimant to see whether the claimant would love to seize the opportunity, would love to apply the award to find a way to promote cooperation among themselves. So therefore, my first recommendation is the best way to promote maritime cooperation among ASEAN is to speed up its negotiation for dispute management mechanism, including the interim measure or the energies cooperation in the area that or they already have the clear guidelines from the arbitration award. To be concrete, perhaps the maritime delimitation between Philippines and Malaysia, for example, or Malaysia and Indonesia and Vietnam will help to pave the way for further cooperation between ASEAN, South China Sea littoral state. And even after or before maritime delimitation, ASEAN country always can find a way to cooperate based on UNCLOS, or they can negotiate to find the mechanism for dispute management between them. But otherwise, because we always have to take into account the presence of China, the interest of China, and of course we would wish that China would participate in any form of maritime cooperation in the regions. And therefore, the second recommendation will rest on learning from the good practices and expanding the successful bilateral, trilateral cooperation that we already have in the past in our regions. And to that extent, I would love to come into a different specific area that have been highlighted in the sections. So first, for maritime security, building upon the good work of ARF, ADMM, ADMM+, AMF and EAMF, and responding to the need of economic recovery post-pandemic, the cooperation in maritime security perhaps should focus on the establishment of ASEAN single shipping market by realizing the rural connections. And perhaps it is still quite broad. Therefore, my concrete recommendation when we can focus on the area of applying technologies, new technology, or investing in infrastructure toward net zero shipping. It is also address the commitment that many countries in our regions made after COP26, and specifically apply to maritime areas that's shipping, where many countries in the region have the strength of providing logistic services in that industries. And perhaps in addition to cooperation toward net zero shipping, we can also continue to conduct FTX, that field training exercise, and HADR exercise in order to protect seafarers' right. This right of seafarer is not a new area, but taking into account the new context of the extremely impacts of climate change, as well as the context of the pandemic, then the seafarer right is also an area old but new in the new context and should be addressed as an area for priority. In the second area of IUU fishing, in addition to the measures highlighted in the ASEAN CFDEC joint declaration, that perhaps interagency cooperation would be promoted, especially between law enforcement forces. I agree with our Coast Guard meeting, Coast Guard negotiation, or Coast Guard cooperation. Before we have the idea raised by Indonesia, and recently we have the initiative by the Philippines, and perhaps if the Coast Guard in the region can somewhat form in the way of joint patrol, in preventing not only IUU fishing, but also preventing or joint patrol in order to address the transnational crime, which is re-emerged in the context of COVID context, is also a very helpful idea for promoting cooperation. In the area of energy cooperation, perhaps there are two ways of cooperation. The first one, to stick with traditional energy cooperation in the form of joint development. We have the successful practice between Vietnam and Malaysia, or Malaysia and Thailand. So those are the practice that we can build upon to expand to the other area where we have the overlapping maritime zones between the littoral state in the South China Sea, with the note again mentioned to the country in the southern part, where we can apply the conclusion of the Abidjan Accord to promote the maritime delimitation, or to apply joint development as an interim measures. But energy cooperation can also be conducted with the renewable energies. In the context of new commitment under COP26, renewable energies is an area that required a lot of investment for new technologies, and in this context, offshore wind, solar energies may be a new feasible area for cooperation in energy cooperation. The next one, and which is the last one on the list, which is maritime environment protections. Perhaps the success of the two programs in conservations, like marine-based ASEAN heritage parks and integrated river-based basin management, should be expanded in combination of the targeting climate change's impact and marine debris. Remind us about the situation of marine debris in the regions. We have Indonesia and Vietnam among the most suffer from maritime debris, especially the plastic debris. So therefore, build upon the two conservation programs and expand to the area of environment protection. Perhaps it will draw a lot of attention and address the need in reality of these countries in the region. And the second big questions that raised in our panel is the role of ASEAN dialogue partner in promoting maritime cooperation. Definitely yes. At the moment, we have 10 ASEAN dialogue partners, and each of them will have the strength toward maritime cooperation, either providing the resources the technologies, or just providing the new initiative. So in that way, perhaps if we look at the practice, we already see the ASEAN dialogue partner have been very active and very well demonstrated their interest in the current mechanism. But my recommendation will be perhaps we can build upon the success of the cooperation projects within DOC between ASEAN and China on the one hand, but on the other hand, we can explore the new linkage between ASEAN-led maritime cooperation program, new minilateral initiative like IPMDA. IPMDA also very much interested in IUU fishing, and also, like the previous speaker already mentioned, the information sharing, which is very important for all the area of maritime cooperation. So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation and looking forward for the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nguyen. Apart from just addressing all the, conventional themes, I think a lot of your recommendations are actually, pushing us to think outside of the box. For example, energy, not just thinking about joint development in oil and gas, but in fact, renewable as well. And indeed, a call for, thinking outside of the box in terms of how we collaborate with extra-regional partners. So with that, I'll pass the floor to Dr. Bristol, who will be the discussant. And Dr. Bristol, you have 8 minutes to share with us your comment and assessment, please. Dr. Bristol.
Thanks very much. There's so much to pick up on. I'm going to miss large parts, so my apologies in advance, but I'll do my best. Maybe just to start on, I think that the two speakers definitely touched on many of the same points, so I won't try and identify specific speakers, but there was quite a lot about the range of organizations that are involved, and whether that is a problem. I think someone referred to it as an alphabet soup. I think there's probably some bits of the alphabet we could even add to that. If you look at Indo-Pacific wide organizations like the Quad, has now a maritime agreement from the last summit, and perhaps even the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which is led by India but has multiple partners around the region. Some of these have quite variable geographies, and so could very much be relevant to areas of ASEAN's concern. So maybe there's even more to the alphabet than we originally saw. And of course, I think one of the speakers mentioned some so-called plurilaterals or minilaterals like the Philippines, Japan, US initiative. I mean, there are many of those. I know that Australia's in one with Japan and Indonesia, for instance. So it's a really complicated picture, and there are obviously concerns about stovepiping and overload. But I was interested whether there might also be some positives to this. So I'll send a link afterwards, but there is some research from the University of Bristol on how the amount of complexity in overlapping, it's by someone called Scott Edwards, the complexity in overlapping institutions in Southeast Asia might actually be building trust, that you're having the same conversation across various formats with the same actors. It actually brings some benefits. So a question maybe for the panelists to consider on the pros and cons of so many organizations. China came up various times. I think that's absolutely obvious why. I think people recognized from the discussion yesterday that there was a gap in the rhetoric between the rhetoric and actions of China in this region. And they're just simply not behaving in a way that can generate much trust. I did wonder whether there were some additional mechanisms to the 2016 arbitral awards that we might want to be looking at. The process for submissions to the UN Commission on the Limits to the Continental Shelf, which I think Malaysia, perhaps some others, certainly Australia, have been involved with, might be another way for people to clarify certain claims and views on the types of features that can generate territorial waters, for instance. But I mean, I think, as was rightly pointed out, one of the fundamental problems for maritime cooperation is that you so quickly get into bilateral disputes. I did wonder how we unpack this tension between security and non-security. I think, as was pointed out, it's probably easier to start cooperation on areas of non-traditional security, HADA, maybe some net zero connectivity initiatives, IUU. All of these were mentioned as areas that would be easier than direct maritime security cooperation. but actually maybe it's also an overlap between the two that's worth exploring. So if you look at, for example, environmental protection, if you're looking at coral reef protections, an area that Australia knows a lot about from the Great Barrier Reef, it would be applicable to coral environments in the South China Sea. It would allow you to have a conversation about something which is actually quite difficult to talk about in any other context because it becomes securitized so quickly. So maybe there's this benefit that you can indirectly approach sovereignty and security issues through some of these non-security access points. I think I was interested by the notion of what whether member states have competency over a certain issue or whether it's best approached at a regional level. It seems strange for someone with a British accent to talk about the EU, but I do wonder whether the EU's principle of subsidiarity, the notion that you do as much at the member state level as you can before you go up to regional cooperation, whether there's something worth exploring there. Obviously difficult when you're talking about common goods like maritime issues, but it is something that other regional institutions have explored at some depth. So maybe something we can learn from other parts of the world. I think there was a really interesting point about energy, not just conceiving that in the traditional way in terms of oil and gas, hydrocarbon, undersea rights, but renewable energies. I did want to draw back maybe on an example from Australia and Singapore. At the moment, there's a cable which is proposed. It's called the I'll give you the title afterwards in the sidebar, but there's a Powerlink cable. Oh yeah, Australia-Asia Powerlink proposed to be completed by 2029, which would take solar energy from the hot centre of Australia, put it up through Darwin through a submarine cable that would go the whole way to Singapore and should eventually actually provide about 20% of Singapore's power needs. Now, that would cross about 4,000 kilometres of the sea, mainly through the Indonesian archipelago. It creates all sorts of challenges around regulations from the environment and all sorts of standards, as well as the security of the cable themselves, which would be a critical part of Singapore's energy supply. So I think we tend to think of issues like submarine cables, maybe for a data perspective, but they also have, I think, an energy component to them. So I think that's worth focusing on as well. COVID came up. I think that's absolutely critical. It's not just in this discussion, it's been in other parts of the dialogue. It was mentioned that issues of transnational crime have peaked again since COVID. I think we also see it in areas like IUU fishing. I know that there's been an increase in the numbers of IUU fishing incidents between Indonesia and Australia recently. And I think one of the key points there is that many of the capacity building exercises we would normally be able to do have been interfered with by COVID. So Indonesian and Australian authorities would normally be cooperating in villages across the archipelago, explaining to people how to do best practice, legally compliant fishing. It's just not been possible to do that face to face since COVID. So there's been a real gap in education and capacity building that we need to quickly close. I don't know how much time I've got left, Joan. Do you want to give me a quick spot check on the time? 2 minutes. Okay, I'll do a few more. So there was an interesting point about whether to convene many of these ASEAN mechanisms under, I think, the ADMM. I guess just one response to that would be that it would, of course, at least in my head, it would securitize the issue and put it through defense ministers. And so, perhaps some of these issues about not being able to have conversations in the first place because of bilateral disputes would be heightened if we tried to do everything through the ADMM. But I'm interested in responses on that. I also didn't hear any reference to the code of conduct, which we have heard in other discussions. If we are just going to have, I think it was the argument was that ASEAN plus mechanisms, so mechanisms involving partners outside of ASEAN would be pushed down to talking shop level. Obviously, the code of conduct is proposed as a binding agreement, so I don't know if there's a tension there. And then if I've got maybe 1 minute left, I might just, again, looking at perhaps Australia's as an example, just pick up on that dialogue partner engagement point. I think it's an interesting question whether all dialogue partners should really be viewed as equal in what they can offer in cooperation on maritime issues. I mean, some partners like Russia, I guess, are pretty much absent from any practical cooperation on the ground. I thought it was interesting that Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong, speaking in Singapore recently, and I can share the link if people are interested, sort of alluded to the fact that you know, Australia is uniquely positioned. It believes in ASEAN centrality because, like Southeast Asian countries, Australia is at the convergence of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And you know, I think there is definitely a range of capacity and stake that different dialogue partners have. And I don't know if that's something we want to bring out, that actually there are probably some partners that can do a lot more, and we should probably invest more trust in than others. I would particularly note that Russia probably can't offer us much. And then I think that's probably the end of my time, isn't it, Jane? Shall I stop there? Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bristow, for not only, you know, bringing together some of the key points that both our speakers have raised for our discussion hereinafter, but also sharing, you know, from a ASEAN Dialogue Partners perspective in terms of, you know, what is being done and what, you know, can be emulated as good example moving forward. One key thing that I really drew from, you know, all three speakers is the initial recommendation that really we should start from within ASEAN, or at least that's how I perceive, you know, the presentation. Some key recommendation is that we have to first and foremost, you know, try to, if it's to resolve the delimitation, try to start with, you know, within ASEAN. If it's about cooperation, we need to make it better from within ASEAN before, you know, we think about drawing in extra-regional partners as well. And that, I think, is a point that, you know, I think Lanan highlighted quite a bit as well. If I may, you know, just pose one question to both Admiral Ong and Lanan, both from different perspectives. To Admiral Ong, first and foremost, is that, you know, given your experience within the Navy and, you know, talking about cooperation Navy to Navy, and that, you know, your suggestion as well, has it been a problem in terms of regional countries prioritizing what should be, you know, first and foremost the areas for cooperation? You know, you highlighted that maritime domain awareness as opposed to what was perceived yesterday by some of our extra-regional partners is in fact a priority and has been, you know, well done. But are there other issues where, you know, there may be some skirmishes or you know, divergences in terms of priority, which you think, you know, Southeast Asian countries should come back together to the table to rethink, you know, their priority? A similar question to Lanan from the institutional perspective, right? You highlighted, in fact, there are a lot of ASEAN and ASEAN-led maritime initiatives already looking at maritime security, yet there are indeed, you know, a lot of overlaps and perhaps, you know, inefficiency in that sense. Having said that, you know, all three speakers today still further suggest more cooperations that is required, right? So in that sense, you know, how do we reconcile the need for us to do better, to cooperate better, to actually be able to manage and good order at sea more broadly, perhaps without introducing more new initiatives? So shall we go to Admiral Ong first?
Thank you for the question, Jane. I believe that ASEAN navies as a community is a has a very strong bond, and cooperation among them is very easy to do. In fact, in my experience, the occasions when we have difficulties is when we need to engage in, let's say, some sort of negotiation, and we have somebody from our foreign ministry watching our back, and that's when we have difficult things. That's when things become difficult. But if you let the Navy people in one room, just give them coffee and they will cooperate and they will talk and they will agree. Okay, so I think just answering Dr. Bristow's concern about ADMM being too securitized, I think that would not be the case. I think we have matured over the years, and we can make a distinction between traditional and non-traditional, and we can work with that spectrum of concerns from the way ASEAN militaries and ASEAN navies think. So I hope I answered the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Admiral. Lanan, are you with us?
Well, thank you for a very difficult question, James. But it's a very good one. There is a dilemma between like functional and strategic cooperation in maritime field. We also have a dilemma between like project-based and grant policy on maritime security as well. But for the efficiency and effectiveness, perhaps we can start with small. We can start with multilateral. We can start with functional first, because when I review all the model of like ASEAN in maritime cooperation, I believe that when we can find the scientists, we can find the correct functional cooperation, then it can result in a very good outcome and achievement. So therefore, if it depends on the objective, of course. If we just highlight on the policy, the goal, then perhaps strategic grant policy will prevail. But if we care about effectiveness, then of course goes more project-based and functional cooperation. Thank you.
Indeed, right. But the challenge as we see it to be is that, once we go down the road, there's always going to be bickering in terms of, who is the key stakeholder, who is the interested agency to come together. And that has been something that, been somewhat problematic within the ASEAN structure, going back to, Admiral Ong's list of challenges that, ASEAN have when we try to push forth more maritime security cooperation and initiative. But perhaps now a question, a rather unfair question to Dr. Bristol, if I may, since you are the only representative of the ASEAN Dialogue Partner here in this panel, is that, as ASEAN Dialogue Partners increasingly thinking about, more and more new multilateral initiatives, right? Or trying to promote ASEAN minus X approaches. Is this a sense of ASEAN Dialogue Partners not being fully satisfied or happy with the existing mechanisms? Because, ASEAN Dialogue Partners are part of, a lot of existing mechanisms, from the ARF to the expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum, all having a place and existing avenues to cooperate. Yet we are thinking about, and we see on the table a lot of proposal of unilaterals. So what can you say to that, Dr. Bristol?
Thank you. As you flagged, Jane, perhaps an unfair question. No, I'll have a go. I don't think there is necessarily, I don't think it's necessarily driven by frustration. I think that's what you were asking. Is it because dialogue partners don't feel they're getting enough from the ARF and the EAS and these other mechanisms that they need to create other ones? I think it's, on the one hand, I think it's that these institutions, I believe, can be complementary to each other. I put in the sidebar a link to a recent piece of research which would seem to indicate that actually having multiple institutions looking at the same issue can bring some benefits. But then also, of course, the membership of these institutions will include other partners that are outside ASEAN, and so it's sort of necessary to create some other structures depending on the geography you're looking at. That's not to undermine ASEAN centrality. If you take the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, for example, which I think India has driven, Australia, Japan, I think France and the UK are all supporting different pillars. I think Australia drives the marine ecology pillar, so relevant to today's discussion. I think there's been real steps to make sure that ASEAN is included in that process. And I believe that some of the forums on things like marine ecology were actually done in ASEAN environments first with the help of Singapore before they were done in an IPOI format, or an IPOI format rather. So I don't personally feel, you'll see in the statements of the Quad leaders and ministers when they meet, they will always put ASEAN centrality at the center of what they say the Quad is there to do. So I don't personally think it's driven by frustration. I think it is a reflection that we're working on an Indo-Pacific geography. So ASEAN will always be central to that, but it's not necessary to only work through ASEAN mechanisms. And of course, many ASEAN member states will be part of these institutions, as you describe. And I think ASEAN countries have long decided that there are certain that being in ASEAN does not prevent them from forming other forms of institutions and partnerships.
Indeed, that's a good message to circulate around within ASEAN and also, with ASEAN dialogue partners. And in fact, I believe that's the message that, ASEAN would like to share with our ASEAN dialogue partners as well, is that, just because we are collaborating with one country doesn't mean that it's to the exclusion of others. With that, may I please invite questions from the floor, from those who are joining us virtually. Both on YouTube, if you type your question into the chat box, somebody will transmit that to us on Zoom. And those of you who are joining us on Zoom, if you can just raise your hands, I will be able to call on you to for you to intervene or to ask a question or a comments to our panelists. Well, I don't see any question yet, so I will continue the conversation because I personally have a lot of questions to the panelists, but I don't want to dominate the airtime per se. But really, I mean, if we can continue with the conversation in terms of China coming up, being mentioned by all three speakers. But in this particular panel, right, the issues set aside, we spent the whole day yesterday talking about the challenges in drawing China in. But this is where, I find that sometimes we might not, the sense that I get is that we are talking across each other. Because when we hear, Chinese speaker speak about maritime cooperation, I think they seem to be very positive and enthusiastic about, the level of cooperation with ASEAN partners, right? Yesterday, we heard Dr. Yan talking about the listing a whole list of cooperation. Yet from the Southeast Asian perspective, it's rather different, right? Whether or not, those listed areas of cooperation is in fact a priority area at all when it comes to, maritime cooperation for Southeast Asia. So this gives rise to question in terms of, are we on the same page when it comes to, what we need to do to enhance trust, what we need to do for cooperation, etc., etc. So a question to my ASEAN colleagues first and foremost, even as we say that if regional at the multilateral level, cooperation is more and more lethargic, it's dragging its feet. But even at the bilateral level, perhaps, if you could share, your experience in collaborating with China or any dialogue partners, right? Whether or not ASEAN is being seen as an equal partner in that sense. Perhaps, Dr. Nguyen first. Lanan, if you could share perhaps a Vietnamese perspective on this.
Well, we are lucky enough to have a very successful cooperation with China in the Gulf of Tonkin, but perhaps the context lead to the cooperation is a little bit different. The maritime delimitation in the Gulf of Tonkin between China and Vietnam were conducted in 2000, and it was a maritime delimitation based on UNCLOS. And after the maritime delimitation, the two countries conclude the cooperation in fishery. And to date, the fishery agreement already expired, but at least we can see that it's kind of an equal cooperation in the sense that it applies the legal regimes of the EEGs of UNCLOS. The two sides will contribute an equal maritime zones to form the joint fishing zones. The two sides will join the joint patrol in order to exercise the law enforcement in the joint fishing zones. However, we all know the fact that most of the time the fishing vessel will come over to the joint fishing zones, but in the part of Vietnam, just because of the fishing resources on the other side is much more than the others. So, but that distribution is mostly based on the natural resources. Other than that, we do have some mechanism to discuss the possibility for cooperation with China, but to date it hasn't come to any agreement or achievement. So that is the only experience that we have, and perhaps the equality that we achieve in that model of cooperation very much based on the root cause of the maritime delimitation based on UNCLOS. But whereas in the other part of the South China Sea, it's very difficult to learn the experience from that part, because up to now, China still insists of applying like customary law or historic right, which is not provided under UNCLOS. So therefore, it's very difficult to ensure an equal cooperation in that sense.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nguyen, for giving us the context. I think that is precisely, what I was trying to draw out in terms of, when we think about what kind of recommendations, right, we can give to regional ASEAN member states, either individually or as a regional institutions, in how we cooperate. This more often than not, we like to impose, right, best practices and suggestion from outside of the region, yet understanding the regional context often is missing in that sense. And I just wanted to highlight that. Admiral Ong, if I may get back to you, since I imposed that question on you as well, perhaps to share very quickly the Philippines experience as well, not just cooperation with China, but in terms of the experience in cooperating with extra-regional partners as well. Has that often been a positive experience, and whether you feel that ASEAN's priorities has been taken into consideration? Admiral Ong, please.
Thank you, Jane, for the question. In terms of cooperation, I'm sure we have some other areas that we do cooperate with China, primarily on economic issues or investments, business. But for maritime, in the maritime domain, I think we are locked into the arbitral ruling, so that's already a conversational killer in terms of talking in terms of cooperation. So I think we've drawn the line there, and in terms of respecting each other's position, and we know that we have differences as far as maritime is concerned. This is the question I actually want to pose, is that when you discussed multilaterals earlier, is that multilaterals do not happen by themselves. It's sort of water seeking its own level. And from the Philippine perspective, as I contextualize in the framework I've done for this webinar, if we are not satisfied with in addressing our traditional security concerns within the framework of ASEAN, we will look for other forums to address that. Okay. Now the question now is, and those are happening, I presume those are happening in other member states also, who share the same traditional security concerns like us. So the question now is, how can ASEAN become a relevant actor, still maintain its presence as a relevant actor in areas that wherein some of the member states are not satisfied with issues that are not being addressed. So they will seek to address them in other forums. Okay. So I think the question is relevance. Okay.
Thank you very much, Admiral Ong. In fact, the next person on the list asking a question might be the suitable one to answer the question. Ambassador Ong, and then this is my boss. I see your hand up first. Can we have your comment? But perhaps also, if you may indulge us to address Admiral Ong's question in, how can ASEAN remain relevant? Sir.
Thank you. I raised my hand because I was just triggered off by our Vietnamese speaker's comments about Vietnam and China cooperating in the Gulf of Tonkin, or what the Chinese call Peipu Gulf. Yeah. Because I suppose if there is relative calm and predictability in the Gulf of Tonkin between China and Vietnam with regard to maritime cooperation and maritime activities, perhaps that model or that kind of modus operandi can be applied to some other parts of the South China Sea. Yeah, particularly in the area of fishing and plastic pollution. Fishing is a very critical issue. The way to engage Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam from the ASEAN side is to really talk about how do we ensure fishing fleets from our ASEAN member states do not get into any tight situation or confrontation with Chinese coast guards. Also, Chinese fishing fleets are coming in greater numbers in the South China Sea area. So this is something that we need to think about, because if we just keep on focusing on the security dimension of the South China Sea, we will not be doing enough for our cooperative engagement, ASEAN and China. Moreover, fishing is a very critical issue. And the way we are fishing, according to some studies, in 10 years, there will be no more father fish or grandfather fish. No, it's just baby fish. And that's not enough to sustain our population's appetite for seafood. So how do we go about starting the basic infrastructure for cooperating in South China Sea with regard to sustainability of fish stock and fish supply? Yeah, the Navy and the other military component of our ASEAN member states ought to have a more economic-oriented plan to put across this idea that maritime dispute, yes, but we have a series of confidence building measures to tackle those things. But at the same time, we cannot wait to operate on how to organize a sustainable fishing regime in the South China Sea. Yeah. So we need to start work on this, and if we are talking about another 30 years of ASEAN-China cooperation, ASEAN economic community and ASEAN social cultural community for the next decade. These are issues which I think the military, defense, Navy people have to engage in. And in this respect, they may be useful also for our own ASEAN sectoral body to look at how the defense and those body in charge of fisheries and maritime pollution can work together. At the moment, I don't believe there is a joint mechanism from the ASEAN side vis-a-vis China. Perhaps it's one area that we can talk about. We call it a six-party talks. ASEAN defense, ASEAN pollution, that means ASEAN environment, and ASEAN economic fishery in particular, meeting with their counterpart in or from China. It's something that we need to talk about, because we are now frozen into a specific confrontational stance over claims, counterclaims with regard to territories, with regard to sovereignty issue, with regard to how we approach the UN law, the Sea Convention. In the meantime, illegal fishing is very expensive, and at the rate we are going, today is what we call the Earth Overshoot Day. At current rate of consumption and growth, we are already way beyond what the Earth can sustain, the number of people on Earth. According to the report in the Singapore newspaper today, this one Earth cannot sustain all the population now exists on Earth. We are already 1.74 over. In other words, the Earth cannot sustain the current population anymore. You need another Earth to come around to help us sustain ourselves. So this is an area of work which I think defense and the non-defense bodies in ASEAN can start thinking about how we go forward. While the legal people keep arguing about who has what sovereignty and what areas can be under the respective countries' sovereign authority. We need to think about cooperation. This is in line with what all of you have discussed earlier about going beyond the areas that of military defense, security. Seriously, we are thinking about how can we engage ASEAN and China in a trilateral setting, defense, security, economic, fishery, and maybe even the social impact and the environment, labor, because fishermen they comprise a big part of the workforce in Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I have to on the list. Next up, Dr. Shafia Muhibat. You have your hands up. Question or comment, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Jane. I just wanted to also chip in on giving comments on the issues that we're discussing right now regarding, you were asking about equality between ASEAN and dialogue partners in terms of projects on maritime security. And I do think that there is a difference when we're talking about individual ASEAN member states' cooperation with dialogue partners and a cooperation at the ASEAN level with dialogue partners. And I think this applies to a wide range of different issues, so not only on maritime security issues. I think at the bilateral individual ASEAN member states and a dialogue partner, there is more equality in terms of, especially for the more technical cooperation, there is equality in terms of the issues that are, or the agenda that is to be set. But at the ASEAN level, I do think that, looking at the experiences, sustainability of ASEAN-led frameworks has been quite dependent on the interests of dialogue partners, especially when we take into consideration that there is this proliferation of ASEAN multilateral processes and platforms, which is very costly. And ASEAN has had very limited resources in maintaining all of these different processes and platforms. And thus, the sustainability of these processes and platforms have also been dependent on the interests of dialogue partners. So, and I think as long as ASEAN is, well, quote unquote, dependent on dialogue partners for the sustainability of these activities, there is limited of what ASEAN can do to actually set the agenda. And this is, I think, the consequence of this is what we're witnessing right now, and I think has also been discussed, the creation of other minilaterals that the dialogue partners might judge to be more beneficial for them. And I do think that this is something that is likely to be the trend in the next decades, and I think also something that ASEAN needs to anticipate and adjust to. Thank you so much, Jane.
Thank you, Ibu Fifi, for the very somber and realistic assessment on the ground. But I believe that is precisely, the crux of the issue here then, right? How do we ensure that, and coming back to Emerald Ong's question about relevance, how can we ensure that, ASEAN continues to be able to put forth ASEAN's priority rather than, beating to the tune of our external partners who are the one, funding some of these initiatives, right? No good solution there, but indeed, a issue that we have to prioritize. I'm very cognizant that, we are 1 minute to closing this particular panel, but, I do want to give, the panelists a minute or two each to wrap up. So, I'll seek the organizers, indulgence to allow us to do that. If I may, to go in reverse order though, because I see, Emerald Ong's hands up as well. So, I'll give him the final say. Let's start with Dr. Bristol, a short wrap up and some key takeaways from this panel, please.
Well, thanks very much. I think I've sort of been trying to represent all the interests of all the dialogue partners today. It's just obviously a difficult task to do. I think there's been a really good challenge here about why do we have this proliferation of institutions, and why are certain ASEAN members choosing to form minilaterals with countries from outside the region. I'm not sure I think we've had a diversity of opinion. I think it's an area that requires more thought. I guess viewed from Australia's perspective, I think there is a sincere belief here that these are complementary, and that as long as it's a reliable dialogue partner who is showing that they respect ASEAN centrality and is doing this for the right reasons, that there's not much to fear. But I think those are important criteria. I think not all dialogue partners engage with ASEAN on the same basis. We've focused a lot today on China, and I think there are rightly concerns about the way the gap between what China says and what China does in this region. I also think we need to consider whether ASEAN gets much out of its dialogue partnership with countries like Russia, which bring very little practical cooperation to the region. And we don't have time to talk about that in depth today. But yeah, apologies, I couldn't represent all the dialogue partners equally today, but I gave it my best shot.
Thank you, Dr. Bristow. You know, blame the opportunistic moderator for putting you in a very awkward position there. Dr. Nguyen, please.
Yeah, I think we are living in a very difficult strategic environment. Therefore, in order to promote maritime cooperation, ASEAN need to think in a new way. On the one hand, ASEAN has been successful in maintaining all the ASEAN-led mechanisms that have attracted the participation of ASEAN partners. But on the other hand, the ASEAN partner already formed up some new unilateral initiative outside ASEAN. So in the way to further promote maritime cooperation as well as to maintain the centrality of ASEAN, perhaps ASEAN need to think creatively to create the linkage between the current framework of ASEAN and the other coalition or unilateral initiative in order to better coordinate it and maintain the interests of the regions.
Thank you very much for the very sage advice to ASEAN as an institution and also individual ASEAN member states in terms of, you know, how can we push forward the maritime agenda within the region. Admiral Ong?
Thank you, Jane.
You can conclude in 2 minutes. Thank you.
First, I do agree that we need to desecuritize maritime cooperation in whatever aspects. But for the Philippine side, it's very hard to do that, given in the maritime front, that is the heart of the issue between China. That's why we are hoping that ASEAN can take the cudgels in terms of enhancing cooperation through ASEAN, so for Philippines to navigate those issues, because China and the Philippines cannot do it alone. We need others to help us bridge the gap, so to speak. Second, I am personally concerned about ASEAN being dependent on dialogue partners in terms of driving the vision or driving initiatives. I think that opens ASEAN to a certain level of cooptation, which we should avoid. I think ASEAN should be the one driving the car, so to speak, and heading and telling what direction we should go. Speaking for the Philippines, I think when we do engage with multilaterals, I am aware that it's either the Philippines or it's another ASEAN country that's driving the unilateral, not a dialogue partner, in terms of setting the direction. I take the example of the TCA in Dumalfi. It was Indonesia driving that initiative, and it was Indonesian Defense Ministry leadership that made it successful. So we do have that the gravitas within ASEAN to do this, and I don't think we should allow external actors to do it for us. That's it. Thank you. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Admiral, for the very strong message on ASEAN and its member states. With that, you know, I'm apologies to everyone for being a very bad timekeeper. So I won't even attempt to try to summarize this panel, but simply to invite all of you to join me in thanking, you know, our panelists today for sharing their expertise and their time with us to talk a little bit about, you know, maritime cooperation in the limited time that we have, and we look forward to exploring more of these themes in the following panels and within this project. With that, you know, thank you very much, and I'll pass the floor back to Rocky, please.
Thank you very much, Jane, for moderating the session. And thank you as well for all the panelists for the fruitful discussion. We will now take over around 30-minute break. Our next session will begin promptly at 10:40 Jakarta time. The topic of session 5 will be on connectivity. Thank you again, and I look forward to seeing all of you again in around 30 minutes. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, members of the audience, welcome back to the conference on Towards Open and Inclusive Regionalism. The conference is hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS Indonesia, in cooperation with the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS, Japan, and the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, Singapore. Before we begin today's event, please allow me to warmly greet the people who have helped to make this event happening. First, Ambassador Ong Keng Yong from RSIS Singapore. Second, Ambassador Yutaka Imura from GRIPS. And third, Buklala Juwono from CSIS. Also, I would like to remind participants joining us today at Zoom to take the opportunity that you can access the English-Japanese interpretation feature in the right corner of the application. Now, before further ado, I would like to invite the moderator for this session, Professor Cho Wong-gi from KNDA. Professor Cho Wong-gi is a professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, KNDA. He also serves as the head of the Center for ASEAN-India Studies at the KNDA. In that capacity, he leads the KNDA's policy research on Korea's diplomatic approach to Southeast Asia and South Asia. He was a member of an advisory group at the Presidential Committee on New Southern Policy under the previous Moon Jae-in administration in Korea. His current research focuses on why and how South Korea engages or not in the Indo-Pacific affairs. Professor Cho Wong-gi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raki. Greetings from Seoul. My name is Wong-gi Cho. I'm very honored to be invited to this conference and moderate session 5. We have 3 excellent speakers from Malaysia, Japan, and Cambodia. The first, we have Professor Cheng Chi Kwek from Malaysia. He's the head of Center for ASEAN Studies of UKM Malaysia. And also we have Professor Masahiro Kawai, Representative Director and Director General of Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia. And also we have Dr. Chihyang Banarith from Cambodia. He's a president of Asian Vision Institute. We have 1 hour for this session, and the topic for this session is connectivity. Connectivity that is defined in broad sense. That includes infrastructure connectivity, institutional connectivity, and digital connectivity, as well as people-to-people connectivity. The organizers provided 2 guiding questions for the discussion in this session. The first one is the challenge that we face in strengthening connectivity among the countries and the region. What would be the sum of the major challenges for countries in the region to strengthen connectivity? That is infrastructure, institution, digital, and people-to-people connectivity. So that is one of the main guiding questions for this session. Another one is policy prescription. So what should we do to strengthen connectivity? So how should ASEAN and its dialogue partners advance connectivity through various economic cooperation programs? So we have these 2 guiding questions, and I expect that the speakers and discussant would address this question in a comprehensive manner in this session. For each speakers, I expect 10 to 15-minute presentation, and then Dr. Banarith will discuss for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor and engage in free discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to invite my good friend from Malaysia, Cheng Chi, please.
Thanks very much, my good friend, Mr. Chairman, Wong Yi, and very good afternoon or good morning or good evening to everyone, depending on where you are. I would like to thank the organizers, CSIS Indonesia, GRIPS, and also RSIS for having me here. It's a great honor to take part in this conference series for a second time, and I feel particularly happy to share this panel with Professor Kawai and also Wan Arif. So in the next 10 or 12 minutes that I have, I would just share 3 points that I hope to reflect Southeast Asian perspective about connectivity cooperation in Asia or Indo-Pacific region. And we certainly understand that Southeast Asia is too diverse as a region to have any one single perspective. So I hope that the 3 points will reflect as much common denominators of ASEAN countries' perspective and also outlook on this important issue of connectivity cooperation. And the first 2 points are about realities, and the third and also the final point about response that I hope to address all 2 questions that highlighted by Wong Yi earlier on. So the first point is about connectivity cooperation. By now, it's clear that it's not just about economic and developmental issues, but it is really a geopolitical reality that would stay for a long time. And the second point I would like to highlight is that the connectivity cooperation is not just about big power push. More often than not, it is also about smaller state pools, small state agency matters. And the third and also the final point is that from ASEAN countries' perspectives, clearly the future of connectivity is about compete to connect, and it is not about compete to detach or disconnect in any form. And ASEAN-led mechanism and ASEAN-led framework, primarily in the form of MPAC, it might be inadequate and in fact, in some cases, ineffective, but it is indispensable for the future of connectivity cooperation in Asia and beyond. First thing first, let me briefly elaborate the first point and the second point before I expand the third point. So as I said earlier on, I think connectivity cooperation is not just a geo-economic issue, but geopolitical issue. Many would be very quick to highlight that to attribute this phenomena to China's Belt and Road, 一带一路. But I think it's also important to say that other powers matter in the process. I think, in fact, I think the credits should be given to the late Mr. Abe. He was I think the first one and leading Japan as the first country to realize, to also point out the geopolitical trends of connectivity cooperation. So 2 years after Belt and Road Initiative, Mr. Abe proposed a very important initiative, Partnership for Quality Infrastructure. And he was not just proposing, he was implementing and pushing at various levels, not just unilaterally, but also bilaterally, minilaterally, and also multilaterally through multiple layers of cooperation. For example, he worked very hard to promote and also to convince partners in the region and beyond, primarily early on through member states of Quad, but later on, of course, with United States and also Europe and also G7. So we could see that over the last few years, for example, the geo-economic and geopolitical dynamics converge. We have seen that 2018, for example, EU come up with EU-Asia connectivity, the same year when even Trump, the US, the Trump administration in US also proposed a BUILD Act. And it did not stop at that level. We could see more momentum have been accumulating in 2021 and also 2022 as we speak. For example, EU has upgraded and expanded and launched by launching the EU Global Gateway. And then we have seen G7 has also launched the BW3, Build Back Better World, and most recently the PGII. And we understand that that's happening at the same time where the Quad members early on were talking about blue dot networks. Interestingly, China has also updated its own version. We understand that China early on has proposed the so-called third country cooperation. So meaning that BRI is just about China and individual countries, but also other partners could work together. And more recently, since the last September, China has seems to update the mechanism for connectivity by proposing the Global Development Initiative. So I believe that by now it's clear, connectivity is both about geopolitics and also geoeconomics, which brings me to the second point. So in this process and also ongoing dynamics, we could see that it's not just about big power action reaction, but smaller country, the host country agency clearly play some role. I'm not saying like small states force is the most important factor, but clearly it is an important dynamics that we need to pay attention to, and which means that small state pools are mainly about domestic politics. We said that all politics is domestic, and it is the domestic political needs of the ruling elites in host country that convince them and push them to collaborate with big powers, sometimes more than one. And then Belt and Road Initiative, for example, we could see that the small countries are the ones who take initiative in many cases for China to collaborate for their own developmental needs and also the elites' political needs. So the key point here, the bottom line point here is that smaller countries are engaged and embrace external powers, China and beyond, not necessarily or not so much because they like China or they like individual powers, but because they need what China, what other powers have to offer, which brings me to the key point that for other powers to really compete with China, to provide alternative that other smaller countries and host country would consider and also embrace, I think we need to bear in mind that good alternative, it's a concrete alternative. Good alternative is available, accessible alternatives. So a lot of announcement must be translated into concrete cooperative mechanism and scheme in order to entice and also attract smaller countries in the region to collaborate, which brings me to the last and also the final point, which is about the ASEAN-based mechanism. And then by now, I think we can safely acknowledge the limitations and also inadequateness of ASEAN as a group. And as Fifi early on mentioned, I think the cooperation between ASEAN and dialogue partners take place at two levels. One is the individual countries and then ASEAN as a group. For connectivity cooperation, it is very important that in addition and above the individual and bilateral levels, ASEAN as a group must take even more active and also assertive position in order to promote and also shape cooperative connectivity cooperation in the Indo-Pacific era in a less conflictual and a more cooperative and also inclusive way. In order to do that, I think it's very important to emphasize, I think there are a number of risks that explain why it is not just ASEAN countries, but other countries as well, who are worried about the geopolitical driven dynamics where they might result in a risk of polarization, risk of marginalization, and worse, risk of entrapment. I think a more recent example would be about, I think many countries are welcome more alternative and also more schemes, but some scheme might be exclusive in nature. And chip 4, for example, I think the supply chain for the chips in semiconductor involving US and also Taiwan, Japan, and also South Korea. We understand that South Korea, for example, is in a dilemma of whether or not it should embrace chip 4. And that's just one indicator of why and how connectivity cooperation might involve a lot of geopolitical risks. And ASEAN countries as smaller countries clearly are very concerned about this prospect. So the way forward is that I think there is a great need to update and also upgrade the MPAC, Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity. And that should be upgraded and also expanded along inclusive, impartial, and hopefully also integrative manner. And by integrative manner, in a sense that we know that competition is just a DNA for big powers, existing, rising, and also second tier level. So we cannot deny or pretend that competition do not exist, but clearly we need to leverage on competition in the sense that those competition should happen to connect rather than another direction. And I do think that MPAC should be upgraded by inviting more powers in and out of the region with all the schemes that we have heard about the Global Gateway, BW3, and also PGII, in a way that allow ASEAN countries as a group and also individually to really promote connectivity cooperation along multi-layered arrangements. Multi-layered arrangement can take place, for example, bilaterally, can also in terms of minilaterally and also multilaterally, depending on the comparative strength of individual powers in and out of the region. It also depends on the developmental needs and also in terms of the political aspiration of the countries involved. With that, I stop here. Back to you, Wong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chang-Chi. You laid out a very broad proposition, 3 propositions about the connectivity. The first, connectivity cooperation is not just economic cooperation, but it's a geopolitical issue. I think this is very, this reflects the geopolitical reality of the connectivity challenge we have, right? The second proposition you made was that small state agency matters, right? So the small states are engaging and embracing big powers in connectivity cooperation. And thirdly, you pointed out that the future of connectivity is to compete to connect. Yeah, and also you raised an interesting point. In order for ASEAN countries to go forward with strengthening connectivity cooperation, you pointed out that you should upgrade and update MPAC in an inclusive and impartial and integrative way. So later in discussion, would you elaborate a little bit more on this issue? All right, now let's move on to the next speaker, Professor Masahiro Kawai, Representative Director and Director General of Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia. Professor Kawai, please.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cho, for your kind introduction. I am very happy to be here, and I would like to thank Professor Shinoda and Professor Imura for inviting me to this very important event. I have a PowerPoint to share. I just wonder if I can share my PowerPoint myself. Let me try. Can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I want to take a look at this connectivity issue more like some geopolitical perspective, but from also an economics perspective. Particularly, I want to introduce 2 kind of attempts to measure connectivity quantitatively or numerically, so that we can understand the progress or lack of progress of connectivity. Okay, as everybody knows, this important master plan on ASEAN connectivity, which Dr. Quick also mentioned, was a very big kind of boost for connectivity initiatives. Connectivity is very important in strengthening ties among countries, particularly for physical, institutional, and people-to-people connectivity. And connectivity is one of the 4 areas of cooperation under AOIP. And connectivity concept has been quantitatively measured by ASEM, the Asia-Europe meeting, and also the Asian Development Bank for the respective regions. So we can take a look at these quantitative measures to see the progress or maybe challenge that the Indo-Pacific countries face. And then I want to talk about challenges of connectivity and how these challenges could be overcome. I do not want to spend much time, but ASEM and ADB have compiled various indicators to come up with a notion of connectivity. ASEM provides measures of connectivity for the Asia-Europe region. And we see that Singapore, Korea, Brunei, Malaysia, these countries are high performers of connectivity, whereas Myanmar and Laos, PDR, are weak performers. In the context of Asia-Europe connectivity, people-to-people connectivity is very limited, particularly for BCLM or countries, particularly Cambodia, CLM, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Philippines. And physical connectivity is very limited for Lao PDR. And then ADB also provides some metrics of connectivity. ADB takes a look at the trade and investment, money and finance, regional value chains, infrastructure and connectivity, people and social integration, institutional arrangements, technology and digital connectivity, and environmental cooperation. Environmental cooperation is considered to be important in the context of connectivity because of the need for connectivity having to be sustainable. So sustainable connectivity is something that many organizations are trying to achieve. ASEAN plus 3 countries. I focus on ASEAN plus 3 countries have achieved relatively strong people and social integration for the Asian region, while relatively weak integration in money and finance and institutional arrangements. And institutional arrangements are particularly limited for BCLM countries. And overall, Malaysia and Korea are high performers, while China is a weak performers. China's connectivity performance is weak relative to its economic size. The ASEM measures and ADB measures are controlled for the size of the economies. Okay. Now, there has been some change in connectivity between 2006 and 2018. The most recent measure for ADB is 2019, which is reported in the most recent ADB report on regional cooperation and integration published earlier this year. But data only available through the ADB website for 2018. Between 2006 and 2018, where COVID affected connectivity. So we are talking about the pre-COVID connectivity situation. And we can see some changes. In the case of trade and investment on top of the table, Brunei and Indonesia and also Myanmar have seen big progress on trade and investment connectivity. For money and finance connectivity, Korea and Laos, PDR, have seen a great deal of progress. Regional value chains, kind of interestingly, Cambodia and Laos, PDR, and Myanmar have gone back. There has not been much progress on regional chains, regional value chains, or supply chains, which is quite interesting. Infrastructure connectivity, some good progress on the part of China. People and social integration, China has seen a backward move, while Brunei has seen a positive move. Institutional arrangements, Japan has seen a good progress. Technology and digital connectivity, almost all countries seeing very strong growth, improvement. Environmental cooperation, not much. So this is the kind of general trend. Now, challenge, I want to point out 4 challenges. People-to-people connectivity. We don't have numerical evidence yet, but we observe a sudden stoppage of people mobility across borders. So people-to-people connectivity has been significantly disrupted by COVID-19. So restoring people-to-people connectivity will be a big challenge. And of course, countries have to put COVID-19 under control. And then countries have to think about how to promote the movement of people, because face-to-face physical interactions are quite important in rebuilding trust across peoples and countries. And then supply chains. Strengthening supply chain resilience is a big challenge. We saw that even before COVID-19, some countries did not make progress, but went back in terms of regional value chains. Supply chains are quite vital to manufacturing and to economic activity, but the supply chains have been disrupted by various types of shocks, natural disasters, US-China trade war, COVID, and Russia-Ukraine war, and the Western economic and financial sanctions against Russia. As Professor Kimura noted yesterday, supply chains have been surprisingly resilient. in reviving trade and goods, not trading services, but trading goods. Trading goods has rebounded very strongly from mid 2020. Of course, most recently, the Russia-Ukraine war is affecting trade, particularly energy and food. But the IMF World Economic Outlook noted the importance of supply chains. However, in recent years, important additional factors needs to be considered. Economic security issues, which may lead to some decoupling of supply chains in high-tech sectors, and also requirements by ESG investors to make entire supply chains ESG compliant. And also the United States and a few other countries are focusing on the importance of human rights. This calls for green supply chain management, as well as human right due diligence in the informing supply chains. And multinational companies are increasingly required to address these challenges when attempting to make supply chains resilient to shocks. And they want to diversify their supply chains. And this provides a great deal of opportunities for ASEAN and other Indo-Pacific countries like Vietnam and India to develop secure and reliable supply chains. Of course, Japanese multinational companies are very much interested in diversification. Just some data for Japanese multinational companies. ASEAN is a very important region. It's a third important region for Japanese outward foreign direct investment after the US and EU. And for ASEAN, the lower figure, for ASEAN, Japan is an important supplier of foreign direct investment after US, EU, and ASEAN. So there is a high complementarity between Japan and ASEAN to build and develop more resilient supply chains in ASEAN. And strengthening infrastructure development and connectivity is also important in ensuring long-term economic development. And both lending and borrowing countries of infrastructure financing need to achieve high-quality infrastructure investment. Economic viability from a life cycle perspective has to be taken into account. Openness, transparency, and debt sustainability is an increasingly important issue to avoid debt traps. I just want to show some data. Japanese infrastructure investment in ASEAN is not small. It's as large as China's, particularly in countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, and also in transport sector, energy and utilities. One more picture, which is quite impressive. When we take a look at Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, their public external debt, sovereign external debt, China accounts for a major portion. In the case of Cambodia, China accounts for close to 50%, Laos about 50%, and much larger than multilaterals share. Multilaterals include World Bank, ADB, and AIIB. So China, as a single country, is the largest provider of financing. This means that when a country is in debt distress, China and other large creditor countries have to coordinate in resolving debt issues. And particularly, China is not a member of the Paris Club. China is strongly encouraged to join the Paris Club. And my final challenge is digital connectivity. Unlike people-to-people connectivity, COVID-19 has boosted digital connectivity because of the need to pursue social and economic activities without human contact. And digital connectivity has been promoting not only e-commerce and digital services trade, but also digitalization and digital transformation of individual economies. So digital connectivity is a major area that needs to be focused. And deeper digital connectivity requires investment in human capital and ICT infrastructure, and also supporting policies like freer access to internet and data flows, and addressing digital divide. And data free flow with trust is something that Japan, Prime Minister Abe, former Prime Minister Abe were pursuing. But at the same time, cybersecurity and data and privacy protection would have to be strengthened. And regulatory reforms at national levels had better be complemented by bilateral and regional cooperation through FTAs or digital economy partnership agreements or mutual recognition agreements. And the promotion of digital connectivity and digital transformation has to be complemented by policy measures to protect those affected, particularly for reskilling and retooling of those affected people. Just a list of international agreements, just I skipped. Now, my final point is the importance of Indo-Pacific economic framework. Yesterday, there was some discussion arguing that Indo-Pacific economic framework may not be important, but I take the view that the Indo-Pacific economic framework is potentially quite important. Potentially because negotiations have just started and we do not know what sort of outcome may be obtained. But I think this region can give the United States a chance to develop and strengthen this framework, IPEF, which focuses on trade, supply chains, clean energy and infrastructure, and so on. So there is some potential for this. Not all ASEAN countries are members, but perhaps other ASEAN member countries may join IPEF. So in concluding, strengthening connectivity among countries in the Indo-Pacific region is vital, given the threat of a possible division of the world economy due to the Russia-Ukraine war and US-China strategic competition. And overall connectivity in Asia appears to be improving over time. although there are some areas like regional value chain where progress has not been observed. Challenges in reviving people-to-people connectivity, which is an immediate issue, and strengthening supply chain resilience, infrastructure connectivity with quality infrastructure investment, and digital connectivity, which is increasingly important with data free flow with trust. These challenges also present good opportunities for ASEAN countries to attract more foreign direct investment, to create a hub of supply chains, more investment for infrastructure, and to upgrade its digital economy for digital transformation. Regional cooperation, including ASEAN +3 cooperation and wider Indo-Pacific cooperation, where ASEAN is expected to play a central role with AOIP, is essential to addressing these challenges. Let's give a chance to the US in developing IPA. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kawai, for your very comprehensive presentation. So you identified major areas of connectivity and challenges, right? So particularly, I noticed that the 4 challenges, right? First, the people-to-people connectivity. So how to restore the restrictions from COVID-19? This is a major challenge. And also supply chain resilience and infrastructure and digital connectivity. Well, in the free discussion, I would like to raise this question for you. So you pointed out that IPF is potentially very important for engaging US in the region, right? So, and also 7 of ASEAN member countries joined and ROK also joined, right? And also you point out that the ASEAN +3 economic cooperation, right? We do have a very elaborated institutional kind of framework of cooperation developed based on the ASEAN +3, right? But for now, it seems to me that because of the strategic competition between US and China, ASEAN +3 cooperation mechanism has not been really kind of functioning very well. So is it possible that you mentioned that, is it possible to make to revive at ASEAN +3 cooperation to make function more kind of actively in a way that would complement with IPF, right? IPF is criticized by China as a kind of exclusive framework. But China is obviously the member of ASEAN +3, right? So if you can kind of have some sort of compatibility between ASEAN +3 and IPF, then that would provide a more inclusive space for regional cooperation. Well, that's my just quick observation, and I'd like to you to address later on. So now let me invite Dr. Banarith. Could you turn on your screen, Dr. Banarith? Okay.
Hello.
Okay,
Yes,
great. Would you make your discussion points?
So thank you very much for the comprehensive presentation and insights. In order to address those challenges identified with regards to people-to-people connectivity, I think we have great potential within the region, especially in the context of people movement under the framework of tourism, labor migration, and international marriage. We can see increasing flow of migrant laborers across the region. So that is perhaps part of strengthening people-to-people connectivity. But of course, we need to create a kind of regulation and mechanism to protect the rights and dignity of migrant workers. So that is something that we need to improve in terms of a mechanism and regulations. Second, when it comes to tourism industry, over the years we have seen intra-regional tourists have increased significantly. In the past, it used to be a tourist from the West, Europe and the US, Australia, but now within Southeast Asia in particular, intra-ASEAN tourists traveling have increased significantly. So that is a positive sign for regional connectivity when it comes to people-to-people contact. Education, cultural exchange also, I think, have great potential within this region as well. Coming to digital connectivity, this is something very tricky in a way and politically sensitive, because within the context of competition which spreading across the spectrum to technology, so digital connectivity may face a certain constraint with regards to the geopolitics of technology across the region. So this is something that we need to figure out how to create inclusive cyber governance that can create or facilitate digital connectivity across the regions. And here we have different versions of, let's say, 5G technologies and other technology that is critical to some countries in terms of security. So this is something that I think ASEAN need to work more to create a kind of a regional norms and regulation on digital data governance and cyber security, so that we talk connectivity in the regions. When it comes to other connectivity frameworks, such as the physical infrastructure connectivity, I think the Belt and Road Initiative have played a very critical role in infrastructure development and connectivity across the regions. And of course, the commitment by the Quad members and under the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, hopefully there are more budget financing in terms of infrastructure development. So this is a kind of new sources of financing for infrastructure connectivity. And from ASEAN perspective, we wish to see the complementarity of this infrastructure development initiative, either from China or from the United States or Japan or the European Union. It should complement to regional infrastructure connectivity. But of course, as mentioned earlier about the risks with regards to our reliance on a different source of financing, so that the risk can be mitigated by having more options, so that the small states or developing countries like Cambodia and Laos can have more options to get access to a different source of financing, because I think no one want to rely so much on any single country for financing. So, but they need to have options, available options. So that is a very critical that other countries need to understand how to create more option sources of financing infrastructure, especially for the Mekong country like Cambodia and Laos. So down the road, when we talk about connectivity, we need to understand it in a very comprehensive and holistic manner. As Professor Kawai mentioned, that connectivity from hard to soft infrastructure, connectivity, people connectivity, digital connectivity, and so on. So we need to understand connectivity in a very comprehensive and try to understand connectivity from the complementary perspective. So ASEAN welcome all initiatives that complement to ASEAN Master Plan of Connectivity. So ASEAN can play that centrality role in this deepening regional connectivity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Panelist. In your discussion, I think you raised a very important question, right? So Professor Kawai pointed out in his presentation that in particular, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, these countries has a very high level of debt from China, right? So their level of debt distress is a little bit high. And also, Dr. Van pointed out that these countries should have options they have more kind of options other than just reliance, dependence on China. So then what would be some of the ways that these countries, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar in particular, can have more options? That's also another important question. So I'd like to have the speakers respond quickly to the questions raised, and then we'll open the floor. Cheng-Chi first.
Thanks very much, Wong Yi. Since Ambassador Ong is here, let me use the example of Singapore Kunming Rail Link as an example of how the assertion that the proposition that the future of connectivity cooperation in Asia and beyond should be based on an ASEAN-based framework. And this is and also how the three I's that was mentioned earlier, inclusivity, impartial, and also integrative, can be implemented in the actual ground and taking advantage of all the dynamics, power dynamics that we mentioned. So Singapore Kunming Rail Link is actually not new. It was an ASEAN project back in mid-1990s, and it was really about connecting 7, 8 ASEAN countries together with southern China. But inclusivity is important. Looking ahead, we know that over the last 20 years or so, Singapore Kunming Rail Link has achieved a mixed accomplishment. There were achievements in terms of double tracking, spur line, and also the additional link. But we know that many targeted goals were not achieved in many countries. It's uneven. And this is why inclusivity is important, because of despite the name Singapore Kunming Rail Link, I do not think any countries in the region see that as an exclusive cooperation between ASEAN countries and China. So I think Japan, Quad members, other individual countries, powers outside the region can actually come in approaching either bilateral individual countries on the bilateral level, or in terms of the ASEAN as a group. For example, we know that every countries and powers have their own comparative advantages, right? So I think in terms of technicality, they can come in to be a useful partner for individual ASEAN countries that are part and parcel of the Singapore Kunming Rail Link project. And for example, I think also Wan Arif mentioned about more options are better. I completely agree, and that's about the more the merrier. So I think Singapore Kunming Rail Link is a good example to show inclusivity, impartial, and integrative can be done according to the existing ASEAN-based framework. And to relate to my final point, to relate to what Wong Yi, you were trying to kind of pose question to Professor Kawai in highlighting the complementary basis between ASEAN Plus 3, but also APEF. So I do think that the complementary can be implemented through inclusive, impartial, and integrative way. So what is called perhaps it's what we can call as ABCCC, right? It's about leveraging on ASEAN-based connectivity, ASEAN-based concentrate connectivity cooperation. So meaning that we are going to see, and we should encourage the development of a concentric circle of cooperation that on the basis of the ASEAN-led mechanism. And we add the layers, can be bilateral layers, minilateral layers, and also multiple layers according to the comparative strength and also domestic, political, and also development needs of individual countries. Final point is energy connectivity that was asked by Jose in the chat box. I think it's one good example where he was talking about the example of a Singapore-Laos cooperation in hydroelectricity. And he said that he rightly mentioned that by doing that, of course, it increases Singapore's energy needs, but it also exposes Singapore to China's dam policies. And I thought that is a brilliant example, again, to show that why inclusivity is important in the sense that inclusive diversification would be the norm of the day, where as Singapore try to leverage on hydro energy option, clearly there are other options of energy arrangements, for example, solar energies and all that. So it means that you simply have to diversify along the inclusive and impartial way. I will stop here.
Thank you. Thank you for taking the question from the floor. Now, Professor Kawai, would you respond to some of the questions raised?
Okay, thank you very much. I agree with Dr. Quick in terms of the need to strengthen complementarity so that U.S.-China division can be, cannot be widened. U.S.-China conflict, competition can be managed. I think that's very important. ASEAN +3 and also its kind of trade version RCEP is a good mechanism to nurture economic cooperation within the East Asia region, but that excludes the United States. The U.S. had the TPP, and U.S. cannot return to TPP, and instead the U.S. has proposed IPEF, and IPEF covers a wider issue than just TPP. So IPEF is more flexible, and many countries joining this IPEF, we can kind of we can try to manage the U.S.-China conflict. Kind of the East Asian countries, other than China, are the cushion countries, so that the U.S. and China, U.S.-China strategic competition would not develop into more serious conflict. Ideally, the U.S. and China can be on the same boat, but it's not possible for the time being. So if all ASEAN countries can join IPEF, then ASEAN can put important agendas on the table for ASEAN for the US-led IPEF. So, so this coexistence of IPEF and ASEAN +3 initiative would be quite important. And if ASEAN +3 cooperation initiatives are being weakened in recent years, I'm not sure if that's been really weakened. But maintaining ASEAN +3 cooperation is quite important. At the same time, maintaining East Asia-US cooperation would be equally important, and IPEF is an important kind of instrument to do that.
Thank you very much, Professor Kawai. I know that the Singapore is also one of the 7 ASEAN member countries who joined IPF, right? But I remember that last May, Mr. Lee Hsien-loong in Japan said that Singapore is joining IPF, but Singapore is supporting China's bid to CPTPP, as well as Singapore is supportive of China's new initiative, a global development initiative, right? So this kind of inclusive stance. So I'd like to invite Ambassador Ong Keng-yong. Would you like to make some comments on some of the discussion points so far made?
Yes, thank you, Prof. Wong Yi. I think the guiding principle for Singapore's policy outlook is basically, as Professor Quick Cheng Chui mentioned, the 3 I's. We have to be inclusive. We try to integrate whatever proposal, worthy proposal, measurable proposal into existing frameworks. And also this element of being impartial. Yeah, most of the suggestions from various countries or groupings affecting Southeast Asia, affecting ASEAN, have to be viewed in an objective manner. If it is useful for ASEAN and it can contribute to ASEAN's growth and importance in the overall international or global scheme, the Singaporean approach is to accept it and to work with these proponents of such ideas to make it even more beneficial for ASEAN. The overriding consideration for Singapore in its management of all these initiatives or policy-related studies is to maintain the importance of Southeast Asia economically, geopolitically, and to make sure that multilateralism, which revolve around good rules and rule-making, continue to be given the emphasis that they deserve. Because without multilateralism, without good rules, we will be into a very messy, very competitive situation. And this is the reason why Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong has taken a very constructive approach in articulating the value of IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Yeah, we see this a bit far beyond into the digital arena. And as someone said just now or earlier in this seminar series, we need to have a better fix on some of the governance principle or the necessary rules for the new digital 21st century marketplace or the international relations based on all the existing structure that we have. The other important point about Prime Minister of Singapore talking about some of these things is that we have to sustain engagement. Yeah, the idea of having more mega trade arrangements cannot exclude any parties which is actually very important for the growth of our economy, whether regionally or internationally. So China is a very big market for all of us, for Japan, for Korea, for ASEAN countries, for India, and of course, for the Western powers. So how do we incorporate China into our existing framework, whether it is the RCEP or CPTPP or now IPEF? Yeah, each of these framework had a different purpose, and there are differences between them. If we can find a way to engage China in a constructive and mutually respectful and mutually beneficial manner, it will be good for us. So I think the approach of Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong is to talk about it, yeah, and encourage our regional governments, in particular our ASEAN family, to look at these kind of proposal in a broader context and not just be within a very narrow spectrum of our individual countries' national interests. So overall, it's positive, Wang Yi. I think the important thing is now to look at the good part of all these suggestions and initiatives and try to integrate them as what we are trying to do now. Connectivity in today's session, this particular session of our conference, it's not just the framework and idea for infrastructure development, financing, and all that, but it is more importantly how we can integrate everybody, whether under ASEAN framework, ASEAN +3 framework, or APEC framework, and whatever we have. If you look at it, ASEM, which Kawai-san mentioned just now in his comparison of the connectivity metric, ASEM is also very important, and all of these initiatives include China. So how can we find a way to draw the ugly side of competition and contestation into a bit more constructive, mutually beneficial operationalizing of all these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very relevant point. I think your point nicely fit with the Cheng Chi's argument, right? The small state agents matters, and you talk about the inclusive role of ASEAN countries. So can we expect that the ASEAN member countries later on would join China's initiative GDI?
I think it would be a good idea to participate in some of these Chinese proposals, which are projecting itself on a global scale. Hopefully, the Chinese strategic thinker would start to think about how actually their proposal for such global enterprise can be even more beneficial to China if we include Japan, Korea. We are talking about the Asian century. These days, it's not very well spoken of. But if you look at the situation that we have today, in terms of infrastructure development, in terms of proposing new modalities for governance in various contexts in the economic and financial area, China, Japan, Korea, India are critical. And if we continue to play this, I don't want you in here, you can go there, and that kind of policy, it would not be beneficial for smaller states, most of us in ASEAN. And I think in this conference, the last day, last 24 hours or somewhere, we talk about the role of Indonesia. Indonesia is another big economy. It's really the largest in Southeast Asia. And going forward, the digitalization of the Indonesian economy is already on the way. And very soon, it will be a major, major player. So how do we cooperate together? We must find the right balance, right mechanism to integrate India, Indonesia with Japan, Korea, and China. And this can provide the necessary, what we call locomotive for a global economic expansion. That's how I personally think the world should be engaged in. Not to say that Asians will be always great and demanding, but right now, if you look at the innovative industries, the technological development, based on a mass scale across all the countries, what is happening in China, in India, in Korea, in Indonesia, in Japan, is actually very important for our global economic compact. But unfortunately, now the overwhelming attention is still focused on East versus West, Western ideas for certain governance of whatever economic activities and social development seem to be distracting us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Wong Kim Yong. So now
Excuse me, Professor Wong.
I just would
like to share a bit the Cambodian perspective on China Development Initiative. So I think Cambodia have already expressed kind of support to that initiative. And now I think
GDI, right?
Yeah, the Global Development Initiative.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And now China has requested to put this on the ASEAN agenda for the upcoming ASEAN-China Foreign Minister meeting. So we will have internal discussion within ASEAN. But I think largely, I think most of the member ASEAN would express support to that because it complements to the ASEAN Master Plan of Connectivity. So whatever we do within ASEAN framework, we need to make sure that those initiatives complement to ASEAN Master Plan of Connectivity, and we try to maintain this centrality role of ASEAN. So as Dr. Cheng Chi mentioned, ASEAN kind of concentrate or ASEAN focus or ASEAN centric connectivity cooperation. So this is something we try to do. But of course, I think within ASEAN, we need to have a lot more consultation when it comes to connectivity projects in order to maintain our centrality role. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We are already past 10 minutes. So I'd like to invite the two speakers to make final comments before concluding this session. So Cheng Chi.
I have no points to add. I think Ambassador Ong and also Wan Arif have already captured and kind of sum up the issues very, very well.
All right. Thank you. Professor Gawai.
Okay. My presentation was too long, so I do not want to speak too much here. But there was a comment in a Q&A part about the bad aspect of connectivity. I think increasing connectivity is good. But there occasionally there are side effects. Financial connectivity is good, but too much capital inflows and outflows, can lead to financial crisis. People-to-people contact is good, but communicable diseases like COVID could spread easily. So capital controls may have to be introduced, or behavioral restriction on people's movement would have to be imposed. Connectivity has to be cut. So I think policymakers have to pay attention to the negative side effects of connectivity, and when increasing connectivity, policymakers have to be always aware of the possible side effects and how to manage those side effects. Just one more issue which Dr. Van raised. Developing countries, small developing countries need options for infrastructure investment. And I think now developing countries are in excellent position to invite China, Japan, the US, Europe, Australia, and so on to finance investment. But at the same time, this investment connectivity, infrastructure investment connectivity may turn out to be bad if investment is not done on a proper basis. So sustainable investment or quality investment would have to be taken into account. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Kawai. So I'd like to thank everybody. I think we have had excellent presentations and raised some of the most important points about the ASEAN's role as an inclusive kind of player who would kind of make China-US competition more kind of compatible with enhancing regional connectivity. All right, so now with this, I conclude this session. So I would like to thank everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Wongi, for moderating the session. And thank you to all the panelists for the fruitful discussion in session 5 on connectivity. We will now take some break. Our next session will begin promptly at 1 o'clock Jakarta time. The topic of the next session is on Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing all of you again back here at 1 o'clock. From Jakarta, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, members of the audience, welcome back to the conference on Towards Open and Inclusive Regionalism. This conference is hosted by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS Indonesia, in cooperation with the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS Japan, and the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore. For participants joining us today at Zoom, I would also like to take this opportunity to remind everyone that we can access the English-Japanese interpretation feature in the right corner of the application. Now, without further ado, we will now begin today's first session with moderated by Melissa Conley-Tyler on Sustainable Development Goals. Ms. Melissa Conley-Tyler holds decades of experience in Australian foreign policy, including as National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Director of Diplomacy at Asia Link and Research Fellow or Associate in the Asia Institute. Melissa has extensive experience establishing and sustaining Australia-Asia engagement through dialogues involving government officials and academics and media and business. Melissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of the organisers from CSIS, from GRIPS and RSIS. As Rocky says, I've been privileged to know many people across the network, and it's great to catch up with you again, even if virtually this time. So my name is Melissa Conley-Tyler. I'm the program lead at the Asia Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, which is a new initiative. I'm calling in from Canberra, from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I was completely delighted to be asked to chair this session 6, looking at sustainable development goals. From my side, development is a key issue for that our organisation and for the region. If a country like Australia is looking at how do we engage with partners in Southeast Asia, then it has to be around what are the priorities for the region. And if I think of that as, what keeps Southeast Asian leaders up at night, I see it as development, national development in all its forms. So I think it has to be a core part of the shared interest where a country like Australia tries to use all the tools of statecraft. That means putting development at the heart of Australia's foreign policy in the way that we engage with Southeast Asia. So I very much appreciate, for that reason, the chance to be part of the discussion, to hear about development priorities for the region and potentially how countries like Australia can be part of that. And for this reason, I'm so pleased we have such excellent speakers who are joining us today. So we have Alizan Mahadi from ISIS Malaysia. Very good to see you again. Always have the nicest backdrop, may I say. Professor Meda Caballero Anthony from RSIS at Nanyang Technological University. So they'll be speaking for around 10 minutes, as I understand. And then to respond, we have a discussant, Dr. Muhammad Iri Wijaya from the Climate Policy Initiative, and he'll be responding to their thoughts. After that, we will have some online discussion among the participants who've been joining over this last couple of days, and we'll be looking at the Q&A that comes in from our wider audience joining us on Zoom and YouTube. So please, if you have thoughts as you're hearing our speakers, please do share those, and we will do our very best to get to those in Q&A. So I think without any more from me, can I please kick us off by asking Alizan to speak first? Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon from Kuala Lumpur here. So I was asked to speak about the SDGs, especially in the regional context. And what I'll do, if I can share my slides. Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can.
So So I was asked 3 questions. How can ASEAN member states contribute to or achieve the goals set out under the UN SDGs? What role can ASEAN dialogue partners play alongside ASEAN member states in this process? And what are the obstacles hindering states from making progress in the 17 UN SDGs? But before we get to those questions, I think it's worthwhile to just really think about what the SDGs is, and perhaps more importantly, what it isn't. Now, the SDGs is not a convention, it is not a treaty, it is not legally binding. So it's very different from the Paris Agreement, it's very different from the Montreal Protocol, and so on. It has no compliance mechanisms. And if you compare with rulemaking regimes, where rulemaking regimes, they formulate behavioral prescriptions, SDGs, they articulate aspirations, while rulemaking regimes, they direct attention to compliance. SDGs direct attention to procedures for generating enthusiasms. So it's really about mobilization of support. SDGs, they have, of course, is time bound, which is 2030. So this is also different in case of rulemaking regimes, which is usually there and remain indefinitely. So it's very important to understand this context. I think in many ways it's contested as a governance strategy. How are you going to achieve these goals when there is no compliance mechanism? However, it's very flexible. So when we talk about cooperation in particular, we have to get this in mind. I'm not going to go in detail, but just worthwhile to kind of look back into ASEAN and sustainable development as well, especially institutionally. The focus was not always firstly on environment even, but that came with the focus on environment internationally. Since 1977, there was an environmental program. So a lot of it was about environmental cooperation from the beginning, but that slowly evolved to sustainable development, especially under the ASCC and so on. So it's quite a significant agenda now, and it has evolved over time. So I'm just going to go quickly with some of these slides. So where are we now in terms of ASEAN progress towards the SDGs? Well, in a nutshell, we're not on track. If we look at the 5 Ps, or at least the 3 Ps of SDGs, people, prosperity, and planet, in terms of the people or more the social goals, there has been some improvement, but even these are pre-pandemic indicators, so that probably has been affected as well. Again, under the prosperity goals, most have seen some moderate progress, but what is challenging especially is the environmental goals, which has seen a regression actually. On top of that, even progress doesn't mean goal achievement. So when we talk about whether we are on track, the region is not on track to actually meet the SDGs. So it's a major challenge. In terms of the countries, this is a ranking by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDG chart. So what I would just want to highlight here is that one of the interesting things about the SDGs is that it's not directly in correlation with the economic level of a country, because it cuts across various goals. So here we see Thailand, Vietnam as the highest one, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, and so on. Right, so that's just as a start before we get to the questions that I was asked to address. So how can member states contribute to or achieve the goals set out in the SDGs? I think, Melissa, you correctly said one of the key things with the setting that the SDGs has no compliance mechanisms means it's very much country driven. So national development, you're correct, Melissa, is the key here. In that sense, there are many ways that the SDGs ASEAN member states can implement the SDGs, but they all have to be nationally driven in many ways. And this can be through across the policy cycle. These are just examples. Many countries are doing this, but within Malaysia, across the policy cycle, SDGs is embedded in our 5-year development plans. So now it's a 12 Malaysia plans, it's strongly embedded. So in terms of the planning, policy planning level, it's embedded in that way. In terms of implementation, Malaysia has SDG roadmaps to guide its implementation. In terms of budgeting, we are now in the process of even doing SDGs budget tagging. So all the budgets are tagged towards the SDGs. So this is in terms of budgets and resource allocation. In terms of further going down, incorporation of SDGs is starting to be seen at sectoral strategies and plans, and even at the local level. So we've developed SDGs at the local level. So across the policy cycle, as well as across various levels, there are many ways countries and member states can implement SDGs. One of the key things we've seen in the region and in Malaysia is really localizing the SDGs. And this is another interesting thing actually about how it's flexible. So it doesn't only mean at the national level. The MDGs was often seen more as a national aggregate achievement, but because the SDGs is a bit more flexible, we are looking also at localization. So one, I would say, innovative structure we did is in the context of Malaysia is bringing in parliamentarians as SDGs champions. Of course, this is just unique in the context of Malaysia. We don't have local elections, and therefore local accountability is a bit more difficult. So we brought in parliamentarians who often are essentially the local champions in Malaysia, and we work across bipartisan, across the government and the opposition towards implementing SDGs at the local constituency level. And localization is quite a strong feature within the region. These are just 3 countries that I've done a quick case study before this comparative analysis. We've got villages SDGs in Indonesia, which implements SDGs in villages, especially the countryside, the rural development side. In Philippines, since there's more of a focus on decentralization, where the local authorities are empowered, they are given a lot of mandate in terms of localizing SDGs. And in Thailand, it's more of a piloting and targeting of various provinces and local governments to implement SDGs. So there's a strong focus on localizing SDGs. I'll just move on quickly now. Another very, maybe a bit boring, but very important part of the SDGs, again, without any compliance mechanisms, the real tool for SDGs is monitoring and reporting. SDGs has its targets and indicators, and there is a process of reporting the voluntary national report to the high-level political forum. So in many ways, this is the, I would say not the most important, but the mechanism that SDGs uses, which is really a reputational mechanism when you report, especially to the high-level political forum. So it's very important for monitoring, and ASEAN in this sense has moved forward quite a lot in terms of setting up the ASEAN community statistical system, producing the indicator reports. And from my analysis, most countries have reported the voluntary national reviews at least twice, which is quite good. And many countries are also reporting, again, the local level voluntary local reviews. Right, so the next question is, what role can ASEAN dialogue partners play alongside ASEAN member states? I'd like to focus on 2. We've got 3 here. One is development model and sharing. Again, Melissa, you've already said it, national development, that's the key. Technology sharing, of course, but I think that's more obvious. I'm not going to touch on that, but also finance, trade, and investments. So firstly, in terms of the development model sharing, I think generally speaking, what the SDGs does is it adopts a consistent or one framework that can be adopted by all countries across the world. And with that, you can share your development models, you can do policy learning across countries essentially. And this has been done. For example, the ASEAN SDGs Frontrunner Cities Program, initiative under the ASEAN Working Group on Environmental Sustainable Cities, is funded by the Japan ASEAN Integration Fund. I won't go through in detail, but this is just an example of 2 key things. One is the ability to share across the different countries how you implement your SDGs, understanding that it's very contextual. But secondly, once again, this is at the cities level. So it allows, in a way, almost bypassing the national level and learning policy models across cities. Sorry. But I think what I want to touch on more is the role that ASEAN dialogue partners can play. Really, we all live in a world where the interests are especially economic interests, will drive decisions. And here, SDGs has a big potential to be where partnerships can be developed through finance, trade, and investments. And again, this is the benefit of SDGs of not being flexible, not being too tied up with the specific rules. So firstly, is in terms of financing of development projects aligned to SDGs. I think everyone knows this, but this, for example, the Indo-Pacific strategy, which they have specifically aligned strongly to the SDGs, provides an example where development assistance, but not just development assistance, all financing can be aligned to the SDGs explicitly. Secondly, within the region, I think there's a lot of capacity challenges to meet, especially the international financial institutions compliance criteria. So I think there's a lot of technical support needed to meet these ESG standards across the value chain, and this is something generally that could be supported. Third is to facilitate mobilizing private sector investment in SDGs aligned and green investments. For example, in the context of Malaysia, Malaysia is focusing quite strongly in terms of the finance sector. We released, for example, the SDG Sukuk and related Sukuk, which is a bond and so on. So I think from an international perspective, there needs to be focus in trade missions and so on in really mobilizing finance across countries. Fourth is there's also a trend towards extraterritorial measures such as the carbon border adjustment taxes that will be adopted in the EU. Again, this is a fear within the various countries. I think there's also various due diligence that will be undertaken from the EU, from the US on establishing rules for sustainable trade and procurement and so on. So I think there's a lot of need for countries to be ready in this sense. What do they mean? There's a lot of dialogue that needs to happen before all these extraterritorial measures come into place. And finally, just support of efforts and investments in sectors to build back better, because of course, especially in the developing countries, the prioritization sometimes will not be for more longer term sustainable development challenges. I don't know how I'm doing with time, but I have just 2 more slides. In terms of the obstacles hindering states from making progress, this is the final question. I think they're quite obvious. Firstly, of course, the times we live in now, we're facing various crises, COVID-19, inflation, climate change, of course, conflicts and so on, and these are compounded. So again, in terms of building back better, I think there is a problem on prioritization within the region. There is a really big risk that, for example, in terms of energy, more carbon intensive ways to generate energy will be prioritized at this moment in time. So this is a very important challenge. Capacity to transition for sustainable development transformation, particularly at the local levels, remain weak. Lack of indigenous technology, including green technology and digital technology within the region, again, remains weak, which requires technology transfer. I'd like to touch a bit on the structural and technological lock-in and path dependence in key sectors. So this is a major challenge where every country's context will be very important to understand. For example, in the Malaysia's efforts for energy transition, we have power purchasing agreements that go on for many years, which focus on coal as the fuel source, and therefore it's very difficult to, we're locked into this agreement and very difficult to initiate energy transition. Okay. Incentive structure, especially for long-term development goals, is there's not enough incentives. So efforts such as carbon tax and so on would be a major change. And finally, I think all of us know this, the political economy, not just at the national level, but at local levels, will also be very difficult to change. So I think just my final slide, I'll just jump to my final point there, which is what I just said just now. Sustainable development the SDGs calls for a transformative agenda, but this transformation requires transition, a slow, perhaps quite a slow transition across various structures, institutions, technology, capacity, and so on. And this requires a lot of collaboration, of course, but also understanding the context of each country and each locality. I'll stop there, Lisa. Thank you.
Look, thank you. And thank you, Alizan. I think that was very broad ranging and covered so much of the field. From my perspective, as coming from one of the ASEAN Dialogue partners, I really liked the focus on the finance side. We have a new government in Australia, and one of the announcements from our new Minister for International Development in the Pacific is to do a review on development finance institution for Australia, which we haven't traditionally had. So very much looking at the financing of projects, but also that idea of how do you mobilise the private sector in, how do you crowd in more funding. So good to know that that's also a focus from your side. So if I can now turn to our second speaker, to Professor Melly Caballero Anthony, whose work I have admired for so long and love seeing whenever I get a chance. So over to you, Melly.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation to join this panel. I'm joining you from wintry Perth. So that explains my sweater. But anyway, I thought I would chime into the discussion and add to what Alizan has mentioned earlier. But unlike Alizan, who was more systematic in addressing the questions that were laid out, what I plan to do in the next few minutes is to focus on three particular SDG goals as they are most relevant now in the region, particularly in light of what has happened. We've just had the pandemic and the global economic crisis. And us in the process of going through where we are with these goals, address some of the key questions on what can be done, right, at the national and at the regional level, and handle issues with regard to not just finance and development, but also enhancing relief for the purposes of this conference, where we want to focus on what can be done at the regional level to also then help countries that have in particular been most vulnerable to these challenges, and then and from that move on to what can be done in terms of setting out regional agenda. So I have let me just share my slides. Before doing so, allow me to to set out
that's come out now, thanks.
Has it come out? Yeah, okay. Two key arguments that I want to put forward. One is something that's already been said, but worth iterating, that we are really far behind achieving the SDG goals, but we're not far behind, but in fact, as a result of the crises that we've had, the pandemic crisis, which have had a significant implications on human security, especially among the vulnerable communities, we have really then wiped out most of the gains that we've had. And when focusing on these three SDGs, whether it is on improving poverty or towards the goal of no poverty, absolute no poverty, improving food security and improving health and well-being, the result of the impact of the pandemic and the crisis has really set us back. Some studies would even say 20 to 50 years behind. Yeah. And the second point is that while indeed the achievement of these goals should start at the national level, it really requires a lot of planning and governance at the national level. The fact that many of the challenges to these goals are transnational, and therefore national capacity is seriously challenged, and that that requires or compels the need for multilateral cooperation. And this is where multilateral frameworks like ASEAN and the ASEAN-led institutions become extremely important. So having set out this 2 points. Let me go to the first impact of the crises on the SDG goal number 1, which is no poverty. So, in fact, if you look at the numbers from pre-pandemic to the present, we could see that the UN SDG report, for example, has noted that the world, as a result of the pandemic and the crises, you can see here, we are 3 years into the crisis. We're still seeing new waves of the COVID-19. We have rising inflation. We have supply chain disruptions. We have labor market challenges and policy uncertainties. In light of all this, it has actually resulted in an additional 119 to 124 million people that were pushed back into extreme poverty a year into the crisis, into the pandemic, right? So if you look at figure 1, the number of people that's living on less than $1 a day, $1.9 a day, has increased significantly from 641 million in 2019 to 714 million. And if you look at it from the context of Southeast Asia, the data shows that the share of population that's living below the international poverty line has increased at the end of 2019 to 2020. And this is in spite of the fact that, after 2021, now economies are looking at some kind of recovery. The poverty levels has not really improved significantly, and numbers are still coming up. I believe yesterday you had some discussion on where we are at, as far as economic recovery is concerned. And even as we are speaking, the numbers are increasingly getting revised, because we are really still seeing the impact of these crises of the pandemic. So when there is, of course, when people have been driven to extreme poverty and affecting economic recovery, then it also impacts on a very important basic need, which is SDG number 2, the reduction of food insecurity. SDG number 2 is zero hunger. It is noted that 161 million more people globally are likely to face more hunger as a result of the pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis. And within Southeast Asia, despite initial gains in actually improving nutrition, right? We have now a number of people, 126 million more, that are facing moderate to severe food insecurity. I note that there have been a number of reports because of rising inflation, food insecurity has worsened, especially since in developing countries, including Southeast Asia, household income uses up to, or put it this way, 75% of household income actually goes to food. So you can imagine the impact of that on the amount of food that have been deprived to people that have been badly affected. And it's not just really as a result of inflation. There are a number of factors that have led to this, the impact of more insecurity. And that is when you look at it from the context of, the food chain, from harvesting as a result of lockdowns, for example, and severe labor shortages. There's been a lot of loss in food that has been produced. There has been some blockages in the supply chain, in transport, and this have resulted in food losses, which we don't really need given the current circumstances. So the FAO number actually puts food losses just from storage, from harvesting to storage to delivery, to almost 30% of total yields. And not to mention the fact that, as with climate change, it's affecting food production, and we are expecting droughts in our part of the world. And you also, with droughts, you're expecting more people that have been displaced. The numbers from the humanitarian community has put the number to at least 700 million globally. And again, that numbers are will actually rise. And you also have, with that, actually also in the other types of natural disaster that will also continue to increase as a result of a changing climate. And this therefore affects, your fisher folks that are responsible for the sources of nutrition, particularly fish and all other seafood. And all of this, again, these are all compounding impact that will set the world significantly as far as meeting the zero hunger goal of SDGs. And I wanted to also highlight that we are looking at the setbacks in the face of what we call the triple planetary crises that scientists that work on the planetary health have actually highlighted. And the planetary crisis that faces us today, right, apart from the pandemic, is really climate change in all its manifestation, the loss of biodiversity that affects our sources of food, and also increasing pollution. So you have economic insecurity, you have food insecurity, and of course now we have, as a result, more insecurity as far as health is concerned. Now, these are just the recent numbers that have come up as we continue to monitor the number of casualties, the number of cases, COVID cases, and the numbers doesn't seem to sort of stop, or at least be, because of we are looking at new variants and also the emergence of other types of infectious diseases. And all this increases is stacked against the other types of what we call the burden of other infectious diseases, which are also rising. And I'm talking in particular the cases of tuberculosis and malaria that is on the increase as a result, among others, of increasing hot weather. Right, and of course also the impact of all of this compounded crises on mental health, something that often is not talked about when we talk about health security. And all of this will have impact also on life expectancy. And given all of these crises, right? So where are we? As I said earlier on, we have been set back significantly in our aims to achieve the SDGs. So at the national level, yes, there are efforts by governments to address many of these crises and to recenter the goals and examine where they are, getting other countries and other actors. We mentioned earlier on the role of the private sector, right, and other non-state actors like your NGOs and your other groups like the religious groups and other social groups that are there, that are helping communities deal with the impact of this crisis to minimize the sufferings of people that have been badly affected. But then we also have regional mechanisms. And this is really where I guess the discussion now moves, because in addressing economic crisis, for example, the Southeast Asia ASEAN, as early as 2020, actually had a comprehensive roadmap in dealing with the crises, which includes, of course, enhancing health systems, I will come to in a bit, and strengthening human security. But what is important in dealing with the crises is really the impact of some of the policies undertaken by certain governments that are affecting the ASEAN goals towards really deepening economic integration in spite of what has happened. In fact, one of the goals of economic recovery is to ensure that you maximize the potential for intra-ASEAN market, ensuring, for example, that you minimize, or remove export restrictions, particularly for basic necessities, basic goals like medicine and food, etc. And second is really the need to ensure that everyone, right, is part of this so-called inclusive recovery. And one way to do that is to make sure that you make use of existing technology. So accelerating inclusive digital transformation. But what does it entail? It entails a lot of investments on infrastructure, for example, better broadband facilities, making sure that you have you're able to help your small and medium-sized industries, because they're the ones that also provide for jobs, that they can actually be plugged into the supply chain, and they're able to access capital that has been made difficult as a result of some of their the businesses that have been closed. So advancing towards a more sustainable and resilient future. And sometimes this word sustainable and resilient future is banded around, but what actually is resilient, right? Is resilient making sure that your people, especially your workforce, are able to bounce back. And how do they bounce back? It means ensuring that they have the right skills. So there are some countries like Singapore, for example, that are focusing a lot of efforts. It's providing a lot of support in reskilling tools so that they're able to weather this, when they are unemployed and able to get alternative employment. When there is a crisis, when you have the right infrastructure, when you have strengthened, for example, your health systems, or when there's a natural disaster, where you make sure that your infrastructure are actually resilient. Infrastructure is actually resilient to weather extreme weather events. This is what it means. It again, as Alisa mentioned earlier, a lot of investments and a lot of capital needed. And you see this agenda, right, stack against record inflation, rising interest rates, increasing debt burden, and competing priorities among governments. And as a result of this, again, sorry, why is it moving? This therefore affects your health security. To address food security, what do we do? As certain countries try their very best to support their farmers and other producers in ensuring that the food supply is made resilient. We have mechanisms in the region that actually helps to mitigate some emergencies. So I put here the ASEAN +3 Emergency Rice Reserve, which was established in 2011 to avert rapid rice inflation and discourage price speculation. But the question that perhaps can be asked moving forward is, do you actually just limit it to rice? Could it be expanded to other commodities like wheat, which is very important, or fertilizers, even vegetables? Or can ASEAN countries, together with the dialogue partners, Japan, South Korea, and China, and even countries like Australia and the United States, can they be sort of plugged into the regional mechanism to address some of the gaps that are there in actually ensuring that food security can be mitigated, food insecurity can be mitigated? And finally, as far as the health security is concerned, the whole adage about no one is safe until everyone is, there is a whole agenda to address issues of health inequity. It includes access to not just to vaccines, but other therapeutics, make it more affordable and available at all levels, from the regional, national to the local levels. The need to ramp up efforts at the national and local public health systems. Given the fact that robust health systems, regional health systems, are critical to the foundations for global health security. Given the fact also that we are not only talking about dealing with coronaviruses, but other emerging diseases. So the agenda for health systems, talk about strengthening health systems, and of course, regional agenda, strengthening efforts at pandemic preparedness, regional cooperation in helping countries scale up their public health capacities, cooperation in scientific and medical expertise, and again, resources to build capacity and diagnostics. So in conclusion, we have a long agenda ahead, serious challenges to be addressed. But I want to reiterate again the second point that I've said, that since countries, particularly developing countries at the national level, will face a lot of obstacles in meeting SDG goals, then regional and cooperation has become even more important in ensuring that we make use of existing multilateral frameworks and strengthen them to help all the affected communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Millie. And I think that focus on the key issues on poverty, on food, on health, what's happening in the region and where there's a potential role for cooperation, I really appreciate it. I'm very conscious that, as well as the pandemic, as well as the planetary crisis that you explained so well, that food insecurity is being food security is being impacted with a bit of a shock at the moment with Russian invasion of Ukraine and what that means, not just in the region, but worldwide. So AP4D is housed at the Australian Council for International Development, and there's a real focus at the moment on pushing the Australian government to focus more on food insecurity issues worldwide and what we can do there. And I hope in that we can build on some of the cooperation I think has gone very well during the pandemic, where though Australian vaccines have had, I think, an important effect in a number of countries, and that broader sense of how can we build, and enhance health systems. That's been, I think, an important focus, and again, a big campaign area in Australia. You could certainly say that, that idea of end COVID for all, vaccine justice, that's very much got through into the public mind. So if I can keep encouraging people to put in any questions they want answered, any reactions they want to share in question and answer, that would be great. And I do promise that I will be coming first to all the people who have been roundtable participants. So think about what you want to say when I call on you very shortly. So if I can now go to Pak Iri, please, if you'd like to give some reaction to what you've heard today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melissa. Very interesting presentation from two respective speakers. I'm really concerned about the highlight that professors Melly said about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also we know recently the impact of the war between Russia and also Ukraine. We, CPI, Climate Policy Initiative, did a study in last years about measuring the greenness index of our early response among 5 ASEAN countries, mostly in Southeast Asia. What we're trying to capture is that the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, increases the number of the people who are living under the poverty rate, and also minimizing the impact, minimizing the budgets of the government, because the government, most of the budget allocated for economic recovery. And this is something that we also afraid in the long term, that many of the government measures happening to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic is more on the short-term perspective, where that many of the government providing subsidy to health, subsidy to fuel, subsidy to food, and so on. But we are forgetting that the long term of our goal is to create sustainability throughout the supply chains of the process. And this is something that we also trying to voice about, what call it as the green recovery, where the government is not only focused on short term, but also reallocating the budget for the recovery efforts, but also in the same time looking at the futures, meaning that this is time for the government to not, when the crisis of the fuel, then the government, many of the ASEAN government rely on the fossil fuel, and now is the time for the government to think about accelerating the renewable energy development in the country. Well, it's in the same time it can help to reduce the dependency on the fossil fuel, but also for the long term, it also can increase the energy security of the countries. The other thing that I also would like to highlight, that many of obstacles that currently happening, and you also, Melissa, put the highlight on the investment, that the finance is really an important aspect when we're talking the 17 goals of the SDGs, where we are in ASEAN member states living on different of the capacity in terms of the human resources, knowledge, cost, capacity, technology, as well as Mr. Alizan highlight that things. But that we need to remember that these different capacity is also can be opportunity to collaborate one to others, right? And unfortunately, lacking of the participation of private sectors is still really happening in the Southeast Asia. This is not because of private sectors are not interested to participate on the SDGs through a couple of the measures, for example, ESG and so on. But this is mostly due to the policy environment that happening in the regions. Many of the government policies currently not really supporting the collaboration with the private sector, for example, related to the renewable energy development. Many of the governments still trying to, let's say, putting subsidy for the fossil fuel rather than accelerating the measures for investment in renewable energy. This is happening in many places in Southeast Asia. So then the perceived risk of the private sectors still see that the green investment is really high because the government not providing appropriate incentive, appropriate risky instruments. So then this forever, I think, will not be a measure to accelerate the sustainable development goals. The Indonesian government is trying to be pioneers on the financings of the SDG through the launching of the SDG bonds. But you know that there are critics on the SDG bond. You know that the SDG bonds government claim to be receiving a good response from the market, but unfortunately, most of the participants, investors who are interested in bond, basically coming from the conventional investors. So this is not because of the investors looking that the green investment is now becoming more profitable compared to the conventional one, but because of the government, providing a lot of incentive to these sectors. So this is one of the measures that we need to have more enabling environment policy to attract the private investors to participate in SDG, because we realize that the capacity of government, as Prof. Meli also highlight, we have limited budget. That therefore let's say participation from the private sector is something that really needed to accelerate our SDG achievement. And a lot other thing that we need to accelerate as well, as I mentioned in the beginning, that we have a lot of different capacity, we have a lot of different gap in terms of the human resources, knowledge, and so on. So we need to have more and more transfer of knowledge, transfer of technology, and more stronger engagement between Southeast Asia members. I think that's my perspective, Melissa. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to moving into broader discussion. So again, a reminder to all our participants on Zoom and watching on YouTube, you can give your questions in the Q&A, and I would very much like to have some there. But first of all, I'm going to call on some of our dialogue participants who are I can see, I'm not certain I can see all of them, but I can see you, Ambassador Yamura, I can see Shinoda-san, I can see you, Ibu Lina, Ibu Fifi, good to see you both again. I can see you, Alex, Dr. Vanadith. Would any of you like to come in and give a reaction? You just have to put up the hand on the little Zoom raise hand button. Press that and we'd love to call on you. And I'm leaving a few seconds. I would like one of you to come in. Oh, I see Ambassador Ong Keng Yong. Would you like to come in?
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you, Melissa. In the interest of stimulating discussions, I just wanted to make 2 points. One is that there is no doubt ASEAN has not been doing enough towards the accomplishment of the Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah, but at the same time, we should not be too hard on ourselves. One, because we are a very diverse region. Two, yeah, we have different form of governance and systems in our respective member states. And as a result of that, they have different priorities and outlook. Yeah, but hopefully they all believe that they must do something good for their citizens. Still, there will be a bit of lethargy in some sectors, while there may be a lot of energy in other sectors. So we cannot be too harsh on our judgment. Also, more importantly, I think Southeast Asia is what I call at the crossroads. We have different ideas, we have different compulsion to do certain things, we have different demands. Yeah. So what for me is important would be the policy outlook of our member states. How are they approaching this challenge of sustainability? How are they aspiring to do something in furtherance of the SDGs? So if we look at it from that angle, I think there is enough to convince me that some of the policy guys are hard at work. The challenge for them is that they have to sell all these requirements and these policy actions to the respective populations. And mind you, the populations in Southeast Asia, they range across so many different ideas and locations and multiple cultures, to put it bluntly.
And how do you manage across those?
Yeah, overall, I would say that policy is determined to make a difference. The speed may be too slow, and we may be running out of time. But it is important for us to identify the ways in which we can accelerate some of these action. And that's why we focus a lot in ASEAN on engagement with other countries, especially the dialogue partners, who can contribute certain resources or at the minimum some ideas on how to move things quickly in a particular direction. The other thing that I want to talk about is that apart from these unique diversity or inherent characteristics of our ASEAN nations, there is now the external push, external developments. And here you can imagine the digital revolution and the technological changes that come about. So the question now is, how do we direct our effort to blend the 21st century ideas with the 20th century policy? Some countries find it a bit more difficult, because they haven't even finished the 20th century plan. And then now 21st century ideas have come and show the irrelevance of the older ideas. So here we therefore need very much to engage our ASEAN dialogue partners, even those who are not partner country yet. If they can have ideas to share, it will be good. So that's my general outlook on this particular subject.
Thank you.
I want to make one last point though. At the end, the UN must be a bit more in our region, right? The UN is only now in our region when there is a military conflict or when there is a breakdown of civilian rule or whatever. And the irony is that we have the UN headquarters for Asia Pacific in Bangkok. So I think there can be a bit more strenuous effort made by ASEAN member states to engage the UN from the Bangkok complex, ESCAP complex there, and to do more. Thank you.
Fantastic. No, thank you. Well, I'm going to go to Dr. Vanadith, and then I'm going to end up by asking our panelist and discussant to respond to the question that we've got in the Q&A. So if you have a look at that, get yourselves ready, and I'll go to Dr. Vanadith.
Thank you very much. I just would like to have one question to our panelists with regards to your assessment of the private financing for sustainable development in ASEAN, the state of that private financing, and how can we increase the blended financing for sustainable development? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And who'd like to answer that one? Unmute yourself. So Alasan?
I can try, Melissa. Of course, it varies across the different countries in our preparedness in terms of the financial institutions. But as I think Dr. Muhammad Ari also shared in Indonesia, in Malaysia, of course, Singapore as well, there's a lot of focus in terms of going into SDG, climate financing, and so on. But I can say perhaps more in the context of Malaysia, which I'm very familiar with. There's a lot of interest, similar to what Ambassador Ong was saying just now. There's a lot of interest in terms of policy, even in terms of the governance. The Bank Negara in Malaysia is very proactive in that sense. But the industry is still not ready yet, I would say. There's still a lot of challenges when it comes to details such as taxonomies and details such as even the capacity of the industry itself. So in that sense, it will take a bit of time, but I think there's a lot of commitment within the region to go into financing, especially looking into the blended financing model as well.
Thank you.
So yes.
No, that's great. Well, as I said, what I might do to end up is I might give each of our speakers just, I know it's only a minute each, but I think our question is a very interesting one, is saying, given limited financial resources, ASEAN countries have to think about prioritisation of SDGs. And in the present time, owing to the energy crisis, the Ukraine crisis, how do you think states should prioritise the SDGs today? So that's from Jose Montes Glados from RSIS. So if I can just ask each of you, do you think we can prioritise, and if so, how? So it's a very quick one, but yes or no, and how would you do it? So I'll start with you, Pak Eri, and then in reverse order, back to Nelly and Abisan.
Sorry, can you repeat again, Melissa?
So the question is whether there's a need to prioritise among SDGs. Do you think it's even possible? And if so, how would you prioritise?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of the, that ASEAN has basic needs, and we need to prioritize a couple of the SDG goals, while also we need to get support from others. A couple of the important aspect, as just Prof. Melly mentioned in SDG number 1, number 2, and number 3, this really happened in Southeast Asia, for example, Laos, in Myanmar, and some of the marginalized society. And this is something that really urgent to be prioritized as the impact of the COVID-19 and also the impact of the Ukraine and Russia war. That's probably my short answer. But of course, we don't need to forget others goal as well.
Well, that's the hard thing, isn't it? So what do you think, Melly? What's your view?
Well, it's good to prioritize certain things depending on where the country sits. But most of the time, in light of what's happening, governments are very preoccupied with firefighting, whatever is most immediate, right? So at the moment, we have to deal with the consequences of, COVID-19 in terms of its impact on health, on food, on the economic recovery. But one must also bear in mind that these SDGs, are very much interrelated. You deal with the economic crisis, you address food insecurity, you address health, right? You deal with reducing carbon emissions, then you improve the environment, so they're all interrelated. And I guess it is important, moving forward, we all have our priorities, depending, I guess, as I said, on where the country stands. But as a region, and I think this is where most of the discussions really are of interest, is to have, a shared vision of where we are. And if I could sort of follow, reiterate what Ambassador Ong has said, ASEAN has his heart in the right place. If you look at all the statements, they're not just statements for statement's sake, but this actually reveals the shared vision of ASEAN and how they want to address these issues, and where they think that dialogue partners can come in, right? So where they can work among themselves, and where the dialogue partners can come in. And in this respect, very quickly, in terms of dealing with the pandemic, for example, the contribution by Japan and the US and Australia in the newly established ASEAN Center for Public Health Emergencies and Emerging Diseases is a very good step in the right direction. And more can be done to really get the assistance and the help, the technical expertise. But on the other hand, in terms of resources and getting the private sectors involved, again, the government is a very important driver, because the government sets the policies, and sometimes you need the government
they can then
urge,
follow.
right, the private sector to do more. Right, focus more on increasing their civic responsibilities, or corporate what is the word there that they use? Social
responsibility, the CSR, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah. So
great, fantastic. Well, Alizan, for your 1 minute.
I'll be very short, because I agree mostly with what's been said, but then very clear about this answer. No goals should not be prioritized, but they should be seen as Professor Mali was saying, in an interrelated, integrated manner. So every country is different. So in the context of every country, you should see which goals provide the largest multiplier effect.
Fantastic. Well, look, and thank you so much. Thank you to Alizan, to Meli, to Iri. That was a fantastic discussion, and I will be taking those messages as to one of the dialogue partners and our development cooperation sector. So I believe I'm now handing back to Ambassador Ong to conclude what looks like it's been a superb couple of days of discussion. Thank you, Ambassador.
Oh, thank you, Melissa. Okay, I am at a loss as to what to highlight from our labor of the last 48 hours. Although we went to bed last night, we were full of ideas from yesterday's discussion, and we were wondering what to say for today's various sessions. But I think overall, the purpose of this get-together, this assembly, is really to talk about how we in our region are striving towards an open and inclusive framework in order to allow us, countries with different ideas, different characteristics, different civilization, to work together. So I benefited from the various sessions. I think they're altogether 6 sessions. Yeah, and I actually enjoy all the sessions. I like some of the participants because they are representative of the next generation. Yeah. Some people say I'm not so old, but I am from a different generation. And listening to the younger colleagues from across our regional countries, I feel very encouraged. Each of them have their heart in the right place and their head in a spin, because they are not sure how to go about integrating what they learn from their parents, what they learn in school, which is likely to be 21st century, and what they believe in their own way going forward. But I go back to some basic points. Number one, ASEAN is actually very magnetic. It has a certain mojo, so to speak. Yeah, a certain magic. Why is it such a quality? Yeah. Of course, if you read today's economic analysis, people will tell you that ASEAN is a market of over 700 million people, and it will continue to grow in the coming decades to become the fourth largest economy collectively, or can even go near to what the European Union is collectively. But actually, more importantly, I think ASEAN is what I call naturally open. Southeast Asia is naturally open. Yeah. ASEAN came in 1967 and organized all the countries of Southeast Asia into this regional body. But generally speaking, yeah, Southeast Asia is a crossroad of civilizations, many different influences, all the big and small voyagers and adventurers. So ASEAN has basically organized the 10 member states into something more long-term and something more adaptable to the geopolitics of the day. And as a result of that, we have turned the naturally open and inclusive ASEAN, let me correct that, turn the naturally open and inclusive Southeast Asia into an open and inclusive ASEAN. So going forward, I feel actually quite encouraged because despite all the shortcomings we have within the ASEAN collective, the two things stand out which encouraged me to think more positively about ASEAN going forward. One is that we are very, what I call, multicultural, multi-layered, and multi-dimensional in Southeast Asia. But ASEAN community building, all the infrastructure and all the hardware and software have basically brought these multi-characteristics into a more organized flow of energy. Yeah, we are still a long way off to achieve the goals that we want for ourselves and what other countries want for us. But the effort made so far has been quite important because we are still peaceful. There is no open warfare between states in our region. But what is more encouraging for me is the second dimension, which is that if you look at what ASEAN and Southeast Asia is all about, everything is in multiple dimensions. We are saying multicultural, multi-layered, multi-directional. But the external players that come into our region tend to be one-dimensional. They are either Western civilizational types, or in recent decades, Chinese civilizational types. One prides itself on being democratic and all things can be done. The other one prides itself in being strong centrally and governed with a great deal of certainty and power in the hands of a few people. So this idea of towards an open and inclusive regionalism is ASEAN way of trying to balance this. We in Southeast Asia, we in ASEAN are naturally open, naturally absorbing things that come our way. But the external party that come our way want Southeast Asian to either accept what they have delivered or make sure that we don't go to those people that they are opposed to. So the AOIP, the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific, is a formal manifestation for what I just said. We in ASEAN try to make do with what we have. We take the world as it is, as we often stress. And in responding to the Indo-Pacific vision and strategies, or the Asia-Pacific character and civilizational qualities, we came out with this thing called AOIP, an ASEAN Outlook. As an outlook, I always wonder, how can we realize it? Yeah, it is not a strategy, it's not a vision, it is an outlook. We integrate what other people think they have about our region. And then we try to find a way to make a living and hopefully exist for as long as we can and to flourish in this effort. So I may be a bit philosophical here, but I think AOIP is essentially a viewpoint, but it is not something that ASEAN member states are trying to propagate beyond ourselves. We are basically defensive. We are not offensive. And other countries outside of our region, the civilizational players from outside our Southeast Asian region, should not take us as an adversary with this AOIP. It is our effort to make a peaceful conciliation with all those ideas outside coming into our region, and to give our own membership a raison d'etre to continue the family connection and to stay within the family. The other sessions dealt with crises in Myanmar, in Ukraine, and economic developments elsewhere, the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic. All these are things that we have to accept on a daily basis, just like in our family, we have to decide whether mother should go out to work or father should stay home and rest since the father is old. Those are the kind of day-to-day questions which families in Southeast Asia have to contend with. And so we have all these various sessions to go deep dive into some of the things that we need to do, or what we have not been doing good enough. We have to try to find more energy, more ways of achieving them, as we have just heard regarding the SDGs. So to sum up, I think there is a lot of work that we have to do going forward. I'm glad that we are able to share all these perspectives openly across the past 2 days. And in the process, we learn more about what Japan is interested in, understand where they are coming from. And then we have heard some of our dialogue partner experts giving us their own viewpoints about how they see things happening in ASEAN region and how ASEAN is coping with the external parties. So overall, thank you to CSIS for putting this together, and GRIPS and my colleagues in RSIS have made their contribution to this whole very healthy debate. It is only the beginning of our search for a better understanding of what is ASEAN, what is ASEAN plus, what is our Indo-Pacific or Asia-Pacific all about. I wish all of you a very healthy journey going forward. We need that. We think we got the COVID-19 under control. Now we have monkeypox. Tomorrow we may have some other kind of pox. Yeah. And the only business that we should be in is to make vaccine and medicine. I think forever we will be prosperous. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ong. I think before I close this this conference, Ambassador Yutaka Imura would like to say a few words.
Thank you, Rocky, for giving me a chance to say how much I'm grateful to CSIS, Yusuf Anandi and his colleagues, and also Ambassador Ong Kim-yong and Rocky yourself. I know that you have been working very hard in the past 2-3 weeks. And also I'm thankful to my colleagues at GRIPS. Maybe I can say just briefly 3 points. One is why we get together in this framework. I think it was already 4 years ago in Singapore. The meeting was organized by Ambassador Ong Kim-yong, and we called this the loosely associated group as PRN-SEA, which is abbreviation of Policy Research Network on Southeast Asia, and where we discuss variety of issues related to Southeast Asia, Japan, and other ASEAN dialogue partners. Initially, we had joint researches like on the theme like religious extremism, the free trade, etc. Then last year we decided to focus on this is the point just Ambassador Kim referred to, AOIP. Last November, if I do remember correctly, we got a meeting to discuss about AOIP because we appreciated very much this initiative by ASEAN countries, and we also had our own idea, free and open in the Pacific initiative, which is very much different from the one that the US has been advocating, and also some West European countries have been advocating. Also, we are our idea is more probably more on the peaceful side, actually. Then, but to be frank with you, last year the meeting was called the meeting on AOIP, AOIP conference. Then this year we have been discussing about this quite often with Ambassador Ong Kim-yong and Yusuf Anandi, and we finally decided to drop this time the name AOIP, and we called it open and inclusive regionalism. That was the theme of this time's conference, because I think Ambassador Kim and Yusuf Anandi a little bit worried about possible reaction on the part of Chinese regarding this initiative, and we better, as ASEAN nations loves peace, maybe we better skip the name and we call it more moderately the open and inclusive conference. And we said, naturally, GRIPS said, okay, we don't want to provoke any useless conflict by having this conference with a name which sometimes some friends outside of ASEAN partnership didn't like. So, but just one day before we had this meeting, President Jokowi visited China, and he's currently in Tokyo, actually. President Jokowi and Chinese President Mr. Xi, apparently, according to joint press statements, they agreed on their possible collaboration between two nations this time they went one step further if you compare with last joint ASEAN-China declaration, which was issued in November last year. That this time they are mentioning that they would promote collaboration of the GDI key areas and AOIP's priority areas contributing to the implementation of the AOIP. Naturally, translation is always tricky. Ambassador Ong wishes to check also with Chinese text, but anyhow, our intention is not provoke any trouble here. Let us what Chinese think about AOIP, and if it wouldn't provoke, we would be very happy to have third conference, which should be on the AOIP initiative. Because this AOIP initiative is attracting so many support from on the part of ASEAN dialogue partners, and I think we should go forward with the idea, and GRIPS is very happy to work with Ambassador Keo and Paisu Fanandi regarding the AOIP. I'm not obsessed by the AOIP, but AOIP is a very good idea for all of us coming from the countries surrounding the Indian and Pacific Oceans. This is particularly important to work together with us for the peace and prosperity, because now European continent, because of Ukraine war, we still don't know what would be the future of security architecture in the European continent. I think this is going to be a very difficult process that Europeans should have to go. And I think now we probably working together peacefully and for the prosperity of the people surrounding Indian Ocean. Probably we can work eventually, hopefully we can work together with Europeans to make European continent, future of European continent peaceful, and making coexistence between Russians and West Europeans or the Western countries peaceful. So I stop here. Thank you very much for all the organizations done by our colleagues in RSIS and CSIS. And also thank you very much for those participating this conference, giving very, very constructive ideas on the 6 topics that we dealt with. And I'm sure that the outcome of this discussion that we had would contribute to eventually, when we can proceed with the implementation of AOIP concept, I think that would be very helpful for organizing better the AOIP. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ong and Ambassador Imura, for the concluding remarks. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, members of the audience, we have finally come to the end of the conference towards open and inclusive regionalism. On behalf of CSIS and GRIPS and RSIS, allow me to give my deepest appreciation for your participation and attendance. Thank you and stay healthy.